we reach the next philosopher in the progression, Heraclitus. Heraclitus. He is not a Milesian. He is a pre-Socratic who started his own school. And from the objectivist perspective, he is the first villain in the history of Western thought. He is also the first enduringly influential philosopher in that his particular views are still widespread today. Nobody today is a hydro-monist. But there are all sorts of Heraclitians wandering around.
The truth is that rules of war are almost never followed in wars.
A post-fight press conference, but for war, and the losing side's like, well, you know, we were trying to fight a fair fight. They bombed our hospitals. They took out civilian targets. They dropped a nuke on one of our major cities. So, yeah, I guess we lost the fight.
Yeah, right. Okay, so anyway, in response to Cleverly, the Russian embassy put out a statement. They said the hostile statements by Britain's top, quote, diplomat cannot be viewed as anything but an attempt to encourage the Kiev regime to carry out more attacks on the civilian facilities and our civilians. Apparently, from their windows, the Foreign Office or Estonia sees residential blocks in Moscow as, quote, legitimate military targets. Now, Dmitry Medvedev, who's the former president of Russia and is currently, what's his role here? He's the chair of Russia's Security Council. He tweeted in English, and he said, the goofy officials of the UK, our eternal enemy, should remember that within the framework of the universally accepted international law which regulates modern warfare, including the Hague and Geneva Conventions with their additional protocols, their state can also be qualified as being at war. Today, the UK acts as Ukraine's ally, providing it with military aid in the form of equipment and specialists, i.e., de facto is leading an undeclared war against Russia. That being the case, any of its public officials, either military or civil, who facilitate the war can be considered as legitimate military targets. Well, these are like strong words. Now, of course, the reason they're saying this about the UK is because this guy Cleverly from the UK came out and basically was defending Ukraine hitting targets inside of Russia. But just to be clear, everything they said there also applies to the United States of America. It's really amazing how the issue of the debt ceiling is portrayed by the establishment, like how they're somehow able to spin this narrative about how, like, well, this is really about paying your bills. You know, like that's what it's about. America doesn't not pay its bills. So what are you, in favor of not paying your bill? It's almost like they try to create this idea in your head that what we're talking about here is like, hey, you know, we bought something and we agreed to pay for it, and now you have to pay for it. Isn't that the responsible thing to do? But really what we're talking about is like, it's like if you were like they put it almost as if the conversation is like, hey, you have a credit card and you charged a bunch of stuff, and I'm just saying you have to pay it now. That's the responsible and morally right thing to do, you know? But really what it is like you charged a bunch of stuff to the credit card that you don't have money for, and now you're saying we have to open another credit card to pay it off. You're like, wait, so then how are you going to pay off that credit card? And like, when we open another credit card, we'll pay that off with the other credit card. What could be wrong with this plan? You can't, and this is the way government policies always work. This is why the government always just continues to expand, is that you can't even start a conversation on, can we go back to pre-COVID levels of spending?
Right, that's the craziest part.
Which is the craziest thing, that you're like, hey, you guys justified this crazy new level of spending because of an emergency. The emergency, which was never really an emergency, but now that's over, and we still don't go back to pre-COVID levels of spending. And even pre-COVID levels of spending were Donald Trump increasing spending from Barack Obama, who all the Republicans said spending was out of control. And then you could, let alone go back to before Obama, who you all like were railing against his spending, and go to George W. Bush levels that he had ramped up spending like an insane amount from the 1990s. I'll never forgive Donald Trump for many things, but particularly I'll never forgive Donald Trump for giving us Fauci through all of 2020. It's just totally unforgivable. And for championing lockdowns and ridiculing places who weren't locking down all the way through at least until the summer of 2020. Is just horrible. And Ron DeSantis was much better on COVID. However, what Donald Trump is saying about the war in Ukraine is fucking perfect. And what Ron DeSantis is saying about it is hard to even discern what his position is.
You know what he needs?
I'm just saying that actually matters a lot more. Look, I'm not supporting either of them, but I figured around this time 2 years ago, I would have assumed I would prefer DeSantis to Trump. Whereas right now, I find myself preferring Trump to DeSantis because the war in Ukraine just matters so much more right now than where you were on COVID as a governor. Now, again, I don't trust Donald Trump to actually do the right thing. He said he was going to do a lot of right things in 2016 and didn't. But if I'm picking between the two of them, which my pick would probably be neither, but I'm at least saying like, fucking this puts Trump ahead of DeSantis in my book. But DeSantis won't even take that strong of a position on Ukraine. You can't just go as woke as you want to with no consequence. And that's been one of the major reasons why wokeism has been winning for the last decade. Because like, look, say on social media in general, right? You could go as woke as you want to, and you're not going to face any repercussions. But if you're going anti-woke, you always got to be aware that you could get kicked off the platform for this. Like you better really pick your next words. You better code it the right way. You know what I'm saying? Like there's all like, so it's this unfair battle. And in general, with corporations, it's been that way for a while. They could just go as woke as they want to with no consequences. But if they don't go woke enough, these left-wingers are going to make their lives hell. So now there's finally a consequence to like, oh, maybe this is the line. Maybe I actually can't go over this, or my stock might plummet by billions of dollars. At least that's something, like we'll see what can happen. I will tell you as someone who has two little kids, it is incredible how much stuff like that is getting pushed. Like whether you go to like Barnes and Nobles or Target or something like that, and in the kids section, it's like dominated by like this kind of like woke push. And I just like, I'm not even trying to indoctrinate my kids into my political views, but I'm definitely not trying to indoctrinate my kids into political views that I despise. So that's just me. They've pushed me to the limit of being like, yeah, okay, I'm not going to those stores anymore.
And this little piggy went for a sex change. Wait, I don't remember that. I mean, this all just falls into the ESG score nonsense where the powers that be make it more profitable to align with the Fed and socialism versus actual profits in the marketplace. However, centralized planning doesn't work for a reason, because it doesn't work. They make blunders. And so at some point, are these companies going to actually be beholden to the market and their customers and to profits? Because there isn't endless money at the Federal Reserve to just give to brands to try and push woke stuff. Well, the same as, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, we're seeing a similar thing even with green energy stuff. Like France is talking about walking that stuff back. Like even as we haven't seen the repercussions of policies that infrastructure that we need to be invested now for us to have abundant energy 5-6 years from now, even with the little bit of investment that they've made in these green energy agendas, you already see them walking it back a little bit because they're like, oh, I don't think this is really working.
It's all the Federal Reserve's fault, all of it. And these huge companies like Blackwater and some of the others, yes, they are imposing standards on these big companies. But I do think that you're right. And I think you make a really good point. Like central planning does tend to fail. And this is just another version of it. And at some point, even having access to credit is not going to be enough if you don't have customers. You know what I mean? Like the business still relies, Target's business still relies on people going into their store and giving them money for products. And so you have to hope that at least that would be enough of a hit that then the carrot isn't worth it. That's kind of what we're going to find out.
Sports is a pretty good example of, hey, if we let the best people compete, look at how profitable and entertaining this is. If we're going to do the DIA thing, let's showcase how that works and force it on sports teams as well, where I can watch one cripple on the field, one lady, one guy with no arms playing baseball, and then you see what that does to a sport, an entire industry, when all of a sudden it's not exciting to watch because you're not watching the best in the world.
Heraclitus flourished about 500 BC. We have about 130 fragments, and they are so obscure that even in the ancient world he had the nickname the Dark, because he was wont to deliver aphoristic, cryptic utterances without explanation, sort of oracular. Now, the essence of Heraclitus's views, on which I want to pause for a few minutes because of his importance, are an attack on what Aristotle later defined as the basic laws of logic. Now, obviously, he could not have attacked the laws of logic explicitly, because the laws of logic were not even known until the 4th century BC when Aristotle defined them. But in retrospect, we can say that the essence of what Heraclitus was getting at, and what all of his followers promptly made explicit, is an all-out attack on the law of identity and the law of contradiction. Now, I assume you're familiar with those laws from objectivist literature, so I'll just say them in a word and explain their nature and importance properly when we get to Aristotle. But in a word, the law of identity is the simple view that everything which is what it is. Everything which exists possesses a nature, possesses an identity. It is something and is nothing else. A is A. And the law of contradiction, a corollary of the law of identity, says, well, then if things are what they are, a thing is not what it isn't. Nothing can be A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. If you are 6 feet tall, you're 6 feet tall. You can't also be not 6 feet tall. You might grow, but at a given time, you can only be 6 feet tall. You might cut off your legs, but at a given time, and so on and so on. Now, Aristotle claimed that these laws were the basis of all logical reasoning, the basis of science, the basis of sanity. And you would certainly, I think, have enough knowledge from objectivism to see why Aristotle would say that.
And, looking beneath the surface of that number, and, you don't have to look too deep to really see the problems with the number. 75% of those jobs, 208,000, were in leisure and hospitality. Those are waiters, bartenders, hotel maids, stuff like that. I mean, these are some of the lowest paying jobs that exist. And those are the ones that we're creating. We lost 48,000 manufacturing jobs. That's a lot of jobs. Those are good paying jobs. Chances are all those jobs were full time. Whereas a lot of these jobs that are added in hotels and bars and stuff like that, they're probably part-time jobs. So we are trading high-paying, full-time, productive jobs for low-paying, part-time service sector jobs. This is not a good trade-off. I think the people that got some of these jobs are not happy about having them. I think they'd prefer to have the better job that they lost rather than the 2 or 3 crappy jobs that they had to hobble together to try to make up for that loss. People are still celebrating, I guess, that the debt ceiling crisis is over. And so I think the markets maybe breathed a collective sigh of relief because this contrived crisis was over. But again, it was not a crisis. The debt ceiling was not the crisis. The crisis is the debt. The ceiling was trying to contain that crisis, trying to mitigate that crisis. And so what we actually did is we removed the protection that we had, as minimal as it is, and we allowed the real crisis, which is the debt, to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And, I get asked a lot, what would be my solution? I mean, what do we do? Because I keep saying, hey, we can't raise the debt ceiling. All right, well, then what do we do? Well, I've got a solution to this problem. The problem with my solution is that no politician would dare propose it because the crisis that it would create personally for the politicians is the problem. It was a crisis for the politicians because if they didn't raise it, they were going to be forced to face reality. They were going to have to go back to their constituents and tell them the truth that the government is broke and that they can't afford to pay all the commitments that they made to win the votes of the people who elected them. That was the crisis. It was a crisis of having to be honest with your constituents. And no politician wants to be honest. So that really was the nature of the crisis. It was a crisis for Congress. It wasn't a crisis for the people. And so Congress had to raise the debt ceiling to eliminate that crisis so it can go back to business as usual, continuously promising something for nothing and not having to deal with the consequences or any kind of day of reckoning. My solution is to deal with the crisis. Don't allow the crisis to get bigger. Deal with it right now. And don't wait for the crisis to explode, right? And have the markets force you to do the right thing. Because when the markets force you to do the right thing, it's going to be a lot more painful than if you grab the bull by the horn and you decide preemptively to do the right thing without being forced to do it by your creditors. So we have this huge problem that needs to be solved. So we need massive cuts in government spending, not the Mickey Mouse, phony cuts that we agreed to, which exempted national defense, exempted Medicare and Medicaid. You can't exempt the biggest line items. Social Security is about $1.3 trillion a year. Medicare is $1.6 trillion a year, and national defense is almost $800 billion. That's most of the spending. You can't take all that off the table and say that's sacrosanct. We're not going to cut it. You're never going to address this problem. It's just going to get worse. So what the politicians have to do is make these substantial cuts in entitlements. And I think the best way to do that would be to means test them. I think that's the only way to do it so that people who are completely dependent on Social Security are still going to get something. But the people who don't need it won't get anything. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's not fair because they paid into it. They didn't pay in anything. They were conned by the government. That's what the government has to admit, that all the Social Security taxes that were collected have been spent. They're gone. Nobody is entitled to anything because there's nothing there. All you can do is rob the next generation, and that's not fair. Why should young people today be taxed so that older people can receive benefits when there's no money to pay them? Because the young people didn't vote for these politicians that embezzled all this money. The older people and they got the benefit of that money because as the government was spending their Social Security money, in theory, they got all that government, right? They were supposed to leave the Social Security money in some trust fund if it was legitimate. But again, the problem was the trust fund had to invest all the money in U.S. government bonds, right? How convenient, because all the money that was collected for Social Security was then loaned to the U.S. government that spent it. And so because it spent all that Social Security money, it didn't have to raise other taxes to cover it. But then, of course, there was no money set aside to cover Social Security benefits. It relies on the next generation. That's why the whole thing is a Ponzi scheme. But once you recognize that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme, it's not fair to force younger people to contribute into that Ponzi scheme, especially when it's impossible for them to ever to collect by forcing the next generation into the same scheme. Once you recognize it's a Ponzi scheme, you've got to bring it to an end. But you have to figure out how to take care of people who would be left destitute if you just completely eliminated it. But that's really what we need to do over time. We need to let the young people off the hook. We need to abolish the payroll tax completely so that people are free to save for their own retirement. You know, the reason we have Social Security, the reason that Roosevelt came up with it, is they thought that, you know, people weren't smart enough to save for their own retirement, right? That they didn't want to arrive at retirement with no money, and so the government was going to take care of it for them. Well, the people would have saved something, right? If the government didn't have Social Security taxes, the people paying those taxes at least would have saved some of the money. The government saved none of it. The government was worse at saving than any individual could have been because the government didn't save a dime. It spent it all.
Heraclitus' point is that these laws are out. As I say, not explicitly, he didn't say that, but that's the meaning. Now, why? Well, he said, everybody is so interested in change. I propose to show that the phenomenon of change is incompatible with these laws of logic. Or put it another way, the phenomenon of change requires the existence of contradictions, requires things which are and are not at the same time. Well, if so, we'd like to know how.
Blinken rejects calls for a Ukraine ceasefire. And this article is by Kyle Anzalone. The U.S. will focus its efforts on arming Ukraine and not attempting to bring the war to a negotiated settlement, America's top diplomat said. Secretary of State Antony Blinken laid out a plan to massively expand Kiev's military before talks begin. So this was a speech that Blinken delivered in Finland on Friday, again, coming out explicitly against a ceasefire, explicitly against a pause in fighting. And again, Kyle said, you know, this is supposed to be America's top diplomat. So the situation is not conducive to diplomacy, especially, you know, more so now that the U.S. and NATO are just not just going to give Ukraine whatever they want. They're not giving them any incentive to seek negotiations. So, I mean, it's just really, I feel like this should just be a huge scandal. The fact that the Secretary of State is just, you know, calling for more war, more fighting, more killing. That's what he wants specifically. So this is the man that seems to be leading the foreign policy. All right, the next one here, shifting over to China. China's defense minister says that a war with the U.S. would be an unbearable disaster. So Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu delivered a speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, and he said that a conflict between the U.S. and China would be an unbearable disaster, a warning that comes amid soaring tensions between the two powers. So he said, quote, "It is undeniable that a severe conflict or confrontation between China and the U.S. will be an unbearable disaster for the world," end quote. So he delivered the warning while calling for more dialogue between the U.S. and China, saying that the two nations should seek common ground and common interests to grow bilateral ties and deepen cooperation. Iran's Navy commander said Friday that Tehran was working to form a naval alliance with several Gulf Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Iraq. So Iran's naval commander Shahram Irani said, quote, "The countries of the region have today realized that only cooperation with each other brings security to the area," end quote. In response to these comments, the spokesman for the U.S. Navy's Bahrain-based Fifth Fleet said that Iran forming such an alliance defied reason, and they blamed Iran for the current tensions in the region. So the U.S. recently stepped up its military activity in the Persian Gulf after Iran seized 2 oil tankers in the region. And missing from the U.S. rhetoric about the issue, missing from now most Western media reports about the issue, is the fact that Iran seized those 2 oil tankers after the U.S. seized a tanker in the region carrying Iranian oil and forced it to discharge the cargo in the U.S. So they stole a shipment of Iranian oil. Very crucial context when you're discussing this issue, but it's missing from coverage of this.
Now, I'll use the same example that I used of the match. and this time derive Heraclitus' conclusion from it. Again, obviously, he did not use this example. I'm going to put this match now through a process of change and ask you to observe it closely. And at a certain point, we'll see if we can show from Heraclitus' point of view why it ends up being contradictory. Now, I've just plucked this match. This is still the same match that I had a second ago. It's still the same match, right? I mean, I didn't take the original match and throw it away and substitute a new match. That would be substitution, but I didn't do that. I still have the same match. All right, this is still the same match. I'm now going to make it go through a process of change. Still the same. All right. Here's the process of change now. All right. Now, is this still the same match? Obviously, it is. Still the same match. I didn't substitute another one. But it obviously is not the same match because it has changed. The tip is now hot and it used to be cold, and it's now black and it used to be white, and so on and so on.
To start with the hot news of the day, and that is the explosion of the Ukrainian dam. Obviously, there's a lot of theories as to what caused it, but let's watch the explosion and watch the water. We can actually talk over it. Can you tell where the explosion came from, Colonel?
Well, it's difficult to be certain, but based on the information that has begun to come out, it looks as though this happened within the dam structure. And more specifically, it may have something to do with the electrical works, the turbine inside. Whether this is the result of deliberate explosives or damage that occurred last year, no one knows. But more and more people are concluding that neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians deliberately destroyed this dam. And the concern at this point, from a military standpoint for the Ukrainians, is that it makes their operation much tougher because the flooded areas, specifically on the eastern side of the Dnieper, make it a very, very difficult for their forces to move through these muddy areas. And obviously it makes an airborne, not necessarily an airborne, but a river-based assault almost impossible. The larger concern, though, is the nuclear power plant up in Zaporizhia.
And how does this water affect the nuclear power plant?
Well, just before I came on, my friend Chuck Spinney pointed out to me that there were concerns because we don't know if all the reactors are offline. The Russians and the Ukrainians tried to move most of the reactors offline. We think one may still be operating. Of course, water is used to cool the reactors. Will the drop in the water level in the river up near Zaporizhia have an impact on the availability of the water? We don't know, but that's a valid concern. A nuclear accident, of course, would be catastrophic.
Colonel, is Ukraine falling apart?
Yes, absolutely. Morale is in the basement, the cellar, if you will. It's very tragic. The military leadership over there knows it. They're frantic. The question is not what happens after the so-called counteroffensive fails, so much as it is Ukraine got anything left at all at that point. And as if the Russians move, and I suspect they will, they're just going to overrun most of the area east of the Dnieper and eventually cross the bridge up at Zaporizhia or at any number of places and move south to Odessa.
Says Heraclitus, this match is therefore the same as it was at the beginning, and yet it has changed. It is not the same as it was at the beginning. At the same time, namely after the change, it is what it was, but it is not what it was. It is and is not. It's the same and not the same. It's A and not A at the same time, which is a contradiction. Now, could we give another example? Oh, yes. Heraclitus is going to give all sorts. For instance, take any one of you. Now, remember the little baby that was born 20, 40, whatever years ago? Are you the same as that little baby? The same entity? Well, obviously, yes, you are. I mean, we didn't take that little baby and grind him up in a meat grinder and bring in somebody new. You are it. We didn't substitute. You are the same. On the other hand, what in the world is the same about you? Now, as the Heraclitians will say, your mental content is certainly completely different, your values, ideas, and so on. According to certain biologists, every cell in your body changes every 7 years, so there's nothing physically left the same. So you're completely different, mentally and physically, and yet you're obviously the same. You're the same, and you're not the same. You're A, and you're not A.
If you're going to tell my mom that she can't have a gas stove anymore and she can only buy an electric stove, but there's a gas hookup in the kitchen, it falls on the back of the renter, which is what does happen. Does that sound like a movie to you? No, it doesn't. I'm not even asking you a question because this is ridiculous. It's not a movie. These are people's lives. And we have the Department of Energy who doesn't even have the guts, the courage to come in here and answer questions about their proposed rule. They'd rather hide in their building down the street than come in here and talk to the American people, talk to the people's representatives. And we do have to fund the Department of Energy. That's coming up in a couple of months. If you can't even come in here and answer questions, why would we fund you? I'm not even joking around because this thing is stupid.
The Department of Education Now, the Department of Education used to be part, I think, of Health, Human Services, Education. I mean, it was part of another agency, or they broke it apart and they made it its own department in 1979. Let's get rid of that department. Complete waste of money. 4,200 jobs. The Department of Education doesn't educate anybody. In fact, it screws up the education for just about everybody. It's a complete waste of money. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the federal government should have any role in education, let alone an entire department dedicated to screwing up education. So let's get rid of it. And by the way, look at how expensive education is right now, thanks to the Department of Education. Before we had the government involvement in education, which started before they devoted an entire department to education, education was cheap. I mean, it wasn't. And, you know, if you graduated from high school, that meant something. I mean, hardly anybody needed a college degree. I mean, if you wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer, you went to college. But for pretty much any other white collar job, a high school degree pretty much was all you needed. Now, a high school degree is worthless. In fact, a college degree is practically worthless, even though it costs like hundreds of thousands of dollars to get one. I mean, only the government could take something like a college degree, render it worthless, but at the same time, make it so expensive. The bottom line is there's so much that we can eliminate in the federal budget, right? It's not about waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Every politician wants to say, let's get rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse. Yeah, because, right, nobody is against that. The problem is they can't even get rid of that, because one person's waste, fraud, and abuse is somebody else's pork that they need to get reelected. But we can't just say we're going to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. We got to say that, you know, we're going to cut the meat, not just the fat. We got to cut the meat out of the budget, entitlements, and all this other stuff. I mean, people are working from home, but what about once we fully implement AI and people can use AI instead of employees? Obviously, if you're going to have a bunch of AI, you just need one closet where you put all those servers and those CPUs or whatever it is that you need to run the AI, right? You don't need a nice big office with beautiful views, and you don't need a cafeteria to feed your AI, right? That they'll work 24/7, right? You just need the power to keep them going. So what's going to happen to this commercial real estate market when you've got big increases in interest rates? You own a commercial building. Your rents are collapsing. And even if they haven't collapsed because your tenants were locked into leases, what's going to happen when those leases mature? Are your tenants going to renew? Of course not. They don't need the space. So rental income is going to collapse. At the same time, interest rates are going up. See, commercial real estate is like a bond. The price of the real estate, the value, is a function of interest rates. The cap rate is interest rate. So if you have lower interest rates, then the present value of those rental streams is worth more. But you have a double-edged sword. If at the same time interest rates go up, your rental incomes go down, it is a perfect storm for the real estate market. And again, add to that the AI, which may increase or decrease rather the demand for commercial real estate, on top of the fact that so many people are now working from home. You're going to see a crash in the commercial real estate market. Now, that also has broader implications for the banks and other lenders who are not going to get repaid, because a lot of this commercial real estate has debt attached to it. And so the values are likely to fall so much that the losses are not going to just accrue to the owners of the commercial real estate. They're going to accrue to the lender, because once you've exhausted the equity. Let's say I bought a building and it was worth 200 million and I had 100 million of debt. I was like leveraged, 50% debt. And so the bank probably thought that was a pretty secure loan, right? We've loaned $100 million on a $200 million office building. But if that office building is only worth $50 million, the owner doesn't lose 150 million. The owner just loses 100 million, right? He walks away from the other 50 because that's the bank's problem, right? Because he's not going to lose more than his equity because he just sends the bank the keys to the building. The problem is the banks own loans on a lot of buildings, right? I might be a landlord. Maybe I own one building, maybe I own two buildings, but that same bank may hold the mortgage on hundreds of buildings, thousands of buildings. So the losses for the banks are going to dwarf the losses for individual landlords of these properties. And now that has big implications for everybody, because when the banks lose money, well, what about the depositors, right? They're creditors of the banks. They've loaned their money to the banks. The banks took that money and loaded out against commercial real estate that has now crashed. And so they no longer have the security to make good these mortgages. So this whole thing is going to implode. And what does that mean? More bailouts, more money printing. The commercial market, that's something that we didn't have in the 2008 financial crisis. That crisis was restricted to residential mortgage because that's where you had the adjustable rate mortgages, the zero down, the liar loans, right? All that cheap money was concentrated in residential real estate. This bubble not only includes residential real estate because rates were at zero for a decade, but it includes a gigantic commercial real estate bubble that has just run into the mother of all pins, right? Not just the pin of normalizing interest rates, but the workers that aren't going to the office and working from home, and AI, which is just starting, which is going to eliminate more workers. So this is a much bigger financial crisis. It's a much bigger real estate crisis. Just if you focus in on the real estate aspect of it, this is worse than 2008, except real estate is only one part of it because you got the entire stock market, you've got credit cards, you've got student debt, you've got everything that has been impacted by over a decade of 0% interest rates. The bubble that we have now that has only started to deflate, and we've barely seen the early stages, right? We've barely seen the tip of this huge iceberg, right? When I said that with subprime, when we saw subprime, I said that's the tip of an iceberg. Everybody said, don't worry about it, it's contained. I would say, no, it's a tip of an iceberg. Well, what we've seen so far with these bank failures is a smaller tip of an even bigger iceberg. And so there's a lot more left that we're going to see once it rises above the surface level.
Now, if you wanted to apply to Thales, the way Heraclitus himself seemed to argue is like this. Everything is water, Thales says. Well, okay. Then after a change, the water is still water. But since it's changed, it isn't water anymore. So it is and it isn't. In other words, we can generalize. Wherever there is change, at the end of the change, we have the same thing. That's involved in it being change rather than substitution. But wherever there is change, at the end of the change, we have a different thing because that's inherent in it changing. Therefore, at the end of the change, we have the same and not the same thing, and therefore change necessarily involves a contradiction. But change is the most obvious fact there is. No one could possibly deny it.
Look, I don't want to just talk about transgender shit too much, okay? I try not to, because I resent that this is even a conversation that we're having as a nation. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, what the fuck, Rob? Like, you're like, all right, look, we're on the the brink of nuclear war, and the currency is being destroyed, and yes, sure, the debt is out of control, and the country's falling apart, but we need to have a national conversation about chicks with dicks, and it has to happen now, and you're like, what? But it's almost impossible not to. And anyway, I'm having a debate about it on Jose Gallison's show, No Way Jose, on Tuesday night, I believe. We're doing it. So I guess I'm gonna have to talk about it there a little bit more. There's issues like that. But there is just something about this thing. It's like this transgenderism thing is like it's a religion, and that's okay. You can have a religion, right? Like there's lots of different religions out there, and even people who are religious tend to think that every other religion except theirs is incorrect. That's kind of the nature of being religious, that you believe in your religion, you don't believe in the other
religions. And then you're going to go fight and kill the other ones.
And then there's only one logical conclusion, which is you must rape and pillage. However, what the transgender religion does that no other religion currently in modern America does is that they demand that you also believe it.
Right.
Or at least that you claim that you also believe it. And that is what a lot of people object to. Like, no, I do not have to pretend that trans women are women. That's an unreasonable claim. Just like in the same way, like if a Christian comes up to an atheist and says, I'm a Christian, I believe Jesus is my Lord and Savior, and I have the right to have that belief. That's a reasonable claim. If they say, I have a right to have a church and go worship Jesus, and other like-minded people can come and we can worship together, that is a reasonable demand. If they say, I also demand that you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and you affirm that out loud, like that is not reasonable. Like that's the liberty line, right? Like that's not reasonable. And so that now there is this push to be like, if you misgender somebody or you refer to someone by the wrong pronouns or whatever the hell it is, that you are somehow have committed some sin and must be punished. That's a thing that a lot of people object to, and I think rightfully so. There was NATO expansion under Donald Trump's watch. Donald Trump sent weapons into Ukraine, even when Obama wouldn't. He also got us out of the INF treaty. The problem with Donald Trump is that he's a big dumb buffoon, and he was just trying to prove what a Russian agent he's not. And I think that's kind of how they trapped him.
Right.
Like he's like, oh yeah, I'm not a Russian agent. I'll be tough on Russia here. And so I don't know. I don't know that it would, but there is a chance he's right about that. The thing is that Joe Biden coming back in brought back in the regime who backed the coup in 2014.
Right.
And I think that definitely like...
But they also certainly sat down with Zelensky and said, hey, here's your payday. Like, you got to play ball with us. I don't know that Trump would have been that. In other words, without us sitting down and saying, this is the way that you're going to play it with Zelensky, I don't know that he would have
Did
been...
you say after Putin invaded?
Yeah.
That maybe the war wouldn't have prolonged if Trump hadn't played.
Right.
Yeah, okay, there's an argument to that. But Trump's claim is that he never would have invaded. That's slightly different. What you're saying is that after he invaded, Trump's position wouldn't have been, you get a blank check to continue this war for another year
Right.
plus. So that's a fair point. That's a fair point too. The thing is, it's a counterfactual. It's hard to know for sure with all of this stuff how it
Right.
would have gone. Would Trump have gotten rolled, and just gone along with it? It's possible. We've seen him get rolled on a lot of other big issues, COVID, and many others. So I don't know. So I don't know about that claim. But it's also anything that Donald Trump says, you have to assume there's going to be Trumpian bluster
Right.
involved in it. The next point is that he can end the war in 24 hours.
I like that one. That was so Trump.
Now, it is very Donald Trump. It's got a real Mexico will pay for it type of vibe about it. You know what I mean?
It done. It already happened.
Already
I'm
happened.
perfect.
Putin's gonna beg me to grab him by the pussy. Okay. Now I don't know if he can end it in 24 hours, but what a great thing to make as a campaign promise.
Right.
Now the pressure would be on him to end it immediately.
And then bashing DeSantis.
Yes.
Because that's a good talking point for bashing DeSantis, is DeSanctimonious over there says that he's going to keep the war going.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. So I gotta say, in terms of what you want to hear from a president, I'm not saying I trust him to do it. I'm not saying he can do it exactly the way he claims. But in terms of what you'd want to hear from a presidential candidate, it's really pretty close to perfect.
This is also a good aspect to this, is that I think we can all acknowledge that war is largely unpopular in the United States, and they have to work really hard to sell it, and then that's kind of why they have to stay in for a long time, because we're already there.
Yeah.
They got to hide the expenses. They
Yep.
got to say Pentagon. They got to fuck up their budgets. But the point is, they do have to sell this to the American people, and the American people don't want it. If Trump, let's say he runs against someone who's not Biden, there's a different Democrat, and the Democrats being pro-war loses them the election, and there's actually almost a mandate from the American people,
Yeah.
we don't want to be in war. It sends a very profound statement to the deep state and the powers that be who are trying to sell wars of, I don't know how many more of these we can sell.
Yeah. Yeah, we may at least have to take a break for a little or something like that.
Yeah.
So look, if nothing else, and I think mostly what I think we recognize, right, is that, okay, there's that quote. Do you remember when Tucker Carlson gave the quote from the CIA anonymous source who said they killed Kennedy? So Tucker Carlson, this was pretty interesting. It was several months back when he had a television show, and it was when Biden declassified some of the Kennedy documents, but still kept tens of thousands of documents classified. And Tucker claims, and I don't know, but I don't think Tucker would just make this up. But Tucker claims, and he knows people, Tucker's connected to this world, and he goes, we had someone speak to us off the record, or on the record with the condition of anonymity, who's had access to all of the files, who's read all of them. And we asked him point blank, was the CIA involved in Kennedy's assassination? And the quote from the guy was, yes.
Well, that's it. Just yes.
Well, the first sentence was yes. And then he said, it's not the country we thought it was. It's all fake. It was just a really interesting way to put it. And I think that probably we all recognize, me and you and anyone who listens to this show, probably recognizes that, the president isn't exactly the president, And it's probably whoever wins, even if somebody with really good ideas wins, there's still a long gap between that and getting that done. And there's a lot that gets in the way of that. There's the intelligence agencies and the shadow government, the millions of bureaucrats, even just who are in between you and getting it done, the corporate press. There's just a lot of elements that, but what presidential political races are, if nothing else, is they are the time where the American people are the most focused on these ideas that they will be for the next 4 years, And they're the time where a message can be spread, you know what I mean, to a wider audience than any other opportunity, than any other time will give you an opportunity for. And if nothing else, the fact that Trump is going to be making this case for the next year and a half is just great.
Right.
Win, lose, or draw, whatever actually happens, just that alone. The fact that, and this is what's great about RFK too, that he's going to be making this case. But Donald Trump was the former president of the United States. So for him to be making it is, if nothing else, at least this is putting this idea in front of the American people, and also particularly right-wingers who look at the guy as a hero, at least giving them permission to be you don't have to support this at all. You can be completely against it.
The only conclusion can be The world is riddled with contradictions. The world is filled with things which are and are not. In fact, we can put it even better. The world is filled with things which are and are not what they were and were not, and what they will and will not become. As one commentator summarizes Heraclitus' view, quote, reality's essential nature lies in being both the same as itself and different from itself. For in order to change, a thing must become different from itself. If it remains the same as itself, it hasn't changed. But also, after it has changed, it must still be the same thing. Otherwise, there has been no change, but simply the substitution of one object for another. A changing thing, then, is an identity of opposites. It both is and is not what it was and what it will be, unquote. Now, you may think that that is a primitive viewpoint. That is obviously got a flaw in it, even if you might not know right offhand what it is, but that there's something obviously wrong with it, and that surely no one, after the development of modern science and Aristotelian logic and so on, could ever have been taken in by that. So I'll take 1 minute out of our packed schedule to read you a quotation.
So now the markets, what are they doing? Well, they're waiting for next Wednesday. The bet on the street keeps changing. 80% now say they're going to hold interest rates where they are. If they hold interest rates where they are, the S&P 500 will keep going higher. We said this last November, that following the last 60 years, the midterm elections, in 60 years, the S&P 500's gone up 16.3%. There's no reason for it to change this year, except if there's a wild card. So now it's up 12%. So got 4% to go, and then it goes down. So that's what we're forecasting. So if the Feds put a pause on interest rates, gold prices are going to go up and equities are going to go up. That's our forecast. If they raise them, equities go down and gold prices go down, because it's all about the dollar. And now the dollar is at its highest level since May. So, it's only June, but it's at a 10-week high. So it more than that. So it's all about high interest rates. The higher interest rates go, the stronger the dollar gets. So that's also bringing down oil prices, because despite Saudi Arabia lowering their output, oil prices still went down today. And the reason they're going down, wait a minute, the World Bank came out today and said that they're looking at a slowdown in the global economy. No kidding. So it's a supply and demand issue. And again, we have all the details in your economic update in this Trends Journal, Purchasing Managers Index, on and on and on. All the numbers are there, all the facts are there, what's going on, and how you can prepare, prevail, and prosper. What else do we have? Saudis in talks to join BRICS banks. Lula wants South American currency. We're mentioning this because they become tired of America's hegemony, whether it's on the economic front or the geopolitical front. And on the geopolitical front, we're talking about the ramping up the United States is doing with the war against China, and Canada and the United States sending in fleets in the Taiwan Straits. What if China was down in the Gulf of Mexico and the Russians were off the coast of New York and the Iranians were down in, Gulf of Mexico too, off California coast? Again, war with China, who will win? Nobody. And not America. They haven't won a war since World War II.
Who said the following, quote, the law of contradiction is afflicted with falsity. It says nothing can both be and not be, but anything that can change defies it. It can both be and not be with the utmost ease, unquote. Now that is not Heraclitus. That is F.C.S. Schiller, one of the leading American pragmatists who taught for many, many years in the 20th century at the University of Southern California. Or if you want another one, who said this, quote, life consists before all just in this, that a living creature is at each moment itself and yet something else. Life is therefore also a contradiction, present in processes, continually occurring and solving itself. And as soon as the contradiction ceases, life also ceases and death steps in, unquote. Pure Heraclitus applied to life. That's Friedrich Engels, the sidekick of Karl Marx. And what the Marxists made is essentially a three-step waltz out of Heraclitus' viewpoint. But we won't cover that in this course. Now, as to what is wrong with this, think about it. I'm going to leave it for Aristotle, who took care of it definitively. So if you don't figure out an answer to it by then, you'll be sure to get it then. Let's go on to Heraclitus' next point.
Top of antiwar.com today, Milley says that Ukraine is well prepared for a counteroffensive. So this was on Monday. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, said that Ukraine was well prepared to launch a counteroffensive against Russia thanks to support from the US and NATO. Milley said, quote, I think it's too early to tell what outcomes are going to happen. I think the Ukrainians are very well prepared, as you know very well. The United States and other allied countries in Europe and really around the world have provided training and ammunition and advice, intelligence, etc. to the Ukrainians, end quote. So, this really goes to show, as it does look like Ukraine has started some sort of offensive, how their war effort is entirely reliant on this support from the U.S. and NATO. Shows how involved the U.S. is in the war. He said that they've provided training, ammunition, advice, intelligence, etc. I'd like to know what he means by etc. But we also know, of course, weapons and all of that type of support. Milley's comments came a day after Russia said that Ukraine launched a large-scale offensive in Donetsk. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed that they thwarted the offensive and inflicted heavy casualties on the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians later on Monday, they denied Russia's claims, but then the deputy Ukrainian defense minister said that Kiev was shifting toward offensive actions in some areas, and U.S. officials told the New York Times that the counteroffensive has likely started, citing satellite data. France objects to NATO opening an office in Japan. So French President Emmanuel Macron objects to NATO's plans to open a liaison office in Japan and thinks that the alliance should stay in the North Atlantic. And this is according to a report from the Financial Times. NATO's push to open its first office in the Asia Pacific is part of the U.S.'s plans to get its Western allies more involved in its strategy against China in the region. NATO's plans to open a Japan office were first reported by Nikkei Asia in early May, and they drew a rebuke from Beijing. People familiar with the matter told Financial Times that France's objection has complicated NATO talks on the Japan office, which have been ongoing for months. He said this last week at some event. He said, quote, if we push NATO to enlarge the spectrum and the geography, we will make a big mistake, end quote. So all 31 NATO members need to agree to open a new liaison office, meaning that France could potentially block the move. News of France's position comes nearly 2 months after Macron said that Europe should not follow the U.S. into a conflict with China over Taiwan.
Now he took change very seriously. On to his second point. Everybody at this time, as you know, was looking for the world stuff, the one in the many. Heraclitus looked like everybody else. But he said, I couldn't find anything that was everywhere. Couldn't be water, because there are things which aren't water. And the same reason it couldn't be earth, and it couldn't be air, and so on. There is, he said, only one thing that I can find everywhere, without any exception. And that is the process of change itself. Everything is changing. Slow or fast, but at least everything is changing. Therefore, he said, if we really want to know the key to reality, if we want the metaphysical phenomenon, of course he didn't use those words, the essence of reality is change. That is the metaphysical essence.
Here's a statement from an article put up by Zero Hedge I found this morning. The World Health Organization, WHO, said it will take up the European Union's digital COVID-19 vaccine passport framework as part of a new global network of digital health certificate. So, they don't call it, vaccine and passports and this sort of thing. It's a digital health certificate. Sounds good. And they have a lot of glowing things, how the advantages of having world government and a world organization to make sure they know everybody has the equal benefit to their great wisdom, and that they will be able to protect their health and have access to health, all these wonderful things. But Chris, quite frankly, I don't know how anybody could be too optimistic about this. People should be concerned. There's no doubt about it. There's still a lot of people. But if you look at the statistics, maybe there's more resistance than they realize. And maybe there's more resistance than so many people suffered for going through the lockdowns, with COVID. So the one lesson here I think that we should emphasize is the fact that they're not going to give up no matter how much failure there is, no matter how much failure there was for lockdown. They just didn't do it right. We didn't have the right people doing it. we need to be authoritarian. We need to force them to do it if they're not smart enough to do it at our suggestion. So I think, Chris, this subject is not going to go away, but hopefully we can contribute to warning the people to beware and build resistance to these plans, not only whether it's the United States, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the United Nations or WHO or whatever. It'll come in all formats. And then we also have to worry about wokeism with the use of government pressure on corporations and having people go along with these plans, not so much because, oh yeah, this sounds like a good idea. This sounds like it'll be very good for the world health. And they might be going there out of coercion and force. So we have to try to keep our eye on the ball, and the eye on the ball. Is it enhancing our liberty and our safety, or is it doing the opposite? If it's doing the opposite, we should caution the people to be very careful. Chris.
That's right, Dr. Paul. And, the fact that the World Health Organization has the nerve to even mention the words vaccine passport, it's astonishing. But like you said, not surprising. Failure never deters people that are interested in power. And, but they must think that this is 2019. Back then, they had the media, they had the social media. The whole thing was churning until the truth finally came out. And, the window of trust has closed on them and their vaccines and all of it. And people back then, many were naive, but many also had no reason not to trust the authorities in that situation. There was no precedent, but they trusted the wrong people, unfortunately. And as a result, there are so many people that will never again get another vaccine, no matter what the conditions, and especially if the government recommends it. And they're also, I see headlines with kids that they're now questioning that. So they ruined their credibility, the doctors, the scientists, the so-called experts, the media, and to now try to talk about vaccine passports, it makes them look very foolish. But, there was not very much accountability. So from their perspective, why not? They need something to do over there. They really should, be close up shop and go get real jobs that actually serve people. But I guess they need something to do. So why not just, reignite this terrible idea of vaccine passport tyranny? One thing that I would recommend for people is always be aware of the globalists and what their schemes are, and try to understand it the best you can. But I wouldn't fear it so much. There are a lot of people that are just terrified. But the UN, the WHO, these they don't have armies, they don't have taxing power. Nobody has to listen to them. Countries pay a lot of lip service to them, especially when it comes to climate. Oh yeah, zero this, zero that, and then they go back to their normal lives. The heck with that nonsense. So nobody has to listen to them. But media and the way things are portrayed to you, it could make it look scary, like all these walls are closing in. But it's not so easy, even imposing things just in this country. I mean, look at what Ron DeSantis did in Florida. He threw a monkey wrench into the whole thing. Even if everybody else was doing the same thing, he said, look at Florida. We don't have masks down here. We don't have all these mandates. Kids are going to school. And everybody saw it, and it just ruined the whole thing. So it only takes a few courageous people, and they always pop up somewhere, you don't know where, to just throw everything off. And it ultimately, at the end, comes down to you. You don't have to listen to them. There are plenty of people, no matter the mandates, getting fired from the jobs, they resisted getting the jabs. So their ultimate sovereignty comes down to themselves. And the further away you get from yourself, the less control you have. And when you go global, they have virtually none. It's just they have very good PR. And, just understanding them and avoiding them the best you can is the best thing to do, not to fear them. The belief is that everybody else is just going to go on with it. No, there's going to be constant conflict. Same way it is within the Republican Party, the Democrat Party. There's conflict within those parties. They hate each other because they are the dictator and the other person shouldn't be. So this idea of globalism is very silly, but it's very enticing for people that have a lot of money and nothing to do. And but we have to, in our own personal lives, understand that this is how it works and just do our best to evade and keep the spirit of liberty alive.
Sometimes, Chris, when I see all this and they're doing things, whether it's this particular subject or anything else on lockdown, you wonder why they're doing it. It seems so strange and it's so harmful, and it seems even harmful for the corporations to participate. So why do they do it? And I think there are some who have a deliberate goal, and that is to turn our whole society into some type of a fascist system. But when you know that the people who make the noise about fascism so much are the ones that are the most fascist, and that I think happens so often, like Antifa, oh yeah, we're going to go after this fascist system. But I think it's what we're dealing with. If we're not dealing with the purity of a communist system that the Soviets had, bad. Not that there wouldn't be some there that would want to go in that direction, but it's a combination of markets that become beneficial to corporations and they take over, and then there's corporatism, which means that it's a form of the early stages of really fascism, and that I think is one thing that's coming about. But I also see some advantages here when you see individuals like RFK Jr. Getting traction because he's shifting a bit, in my opinion, he's shifting a bit from the pure liberal socialistic trends and talks about, the corporations. He's always been good on corporations abuse, but he's beginning to talk more about, pharmaceutical business people, big business with the military. So that's being exposed. I think more people have to see that. And I think it's critical because that's where most of the lying is going on who are the good guys and who are the bad guys and who's telling the truth. But that, I think, is a very, very important thing because right now they have the attention of the major media outlets, but there's challenges there endlessly. So that's why I think that our message is so wonderful and so powerful that it's so vital that the one thing on the bottom line of what we need to preserve is our right to speak out and not be punished for it, which is involved in the First Amendment. And that's what's being challenged right now. So many people are getting punished for speaking the truth. I see what we're going through right now as a challenge between nihilism, where they say, why are you guys worrying about the truth? It doesn't exist. Nobody can objectively define truth. Oh, I didn't know that. Maybe we shouldn't even talk about it. No, they actually believe that. So that is difficult. Now, the other side generally, almost always, has to agree on a higher law, a natural law, something that's bigger than the politicians. And that is the contest that goes on. And right now, though, there's still a lot of nihilists out there claiming, you guys don't know the truth. They cover it over. I keep thinking, when I listen to some of the politicians, they don't believe any of this, but they're saying words. But the thing of it is, I think after a while, the people wake up and say, I don't believe them. And that's why it's good to hear the story when they do a poll and find out that 68% of the American people don't trust the government. I mean, that's not good that happens, but it's good if if it's true and the people have recognized it, because that's the step in going in the right direction. But it is a battle, I think, between truth and the liars who think it's their religious duty, in a religious sense, that we shouldn't have these people using morality to defend some of these principles and talking about a natural law. So I think we're in the midst of this battle. We're going to hear about it because, quite frankly, it's been going on for thousands of years. So we have our ups and downs. Right now, we've had 100 and some years of a loss of liberty and a concept and understanding of liberty. And right now, I think there is a true awakening of people becoming aware of what it is. But we have a long way to go to prevent the building and the more control by those who don't want to tell the truth, who represents the authoritarians, and the people have to be taken care of. So if we have a little bit of problem with medicine, the United Nations and WHO will come to their rescue and make sure we have perfect medical care. That attitude has to be changed, and we will do our best to understand and pass out and spread the message of liberty, because I'm convinced if you want prosperity and peace, that's the way to go. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Now, the word that he used is becoming, usually spelled with a capital B, becoming. Everything is becoming, changing, evolving, developing, in process. Now, since he made this metaphysical, it follows that it applied to everything, not just to sticks and stones, but sealing wax and kings and the whole works. And therefore, Heraclitus took the view that everything is changing, in every respect, at every instant. Change governs everything. And therefore, nothing remains the same for 2 consecutive instants in any respect. Now, his famous sentence illustrating this is, you can't step into the same river twice, for fresh waters are always flowing in. Now, that for him is the paradigm, the example of reality. You try to put your foot in it the next time, it's different, it's changed, and everything is like that.
The U.S. falsely accuses Roger Waters of anti-Semitism. That's right, the U.S. government. The State Department has falsely accused rock legend Roger Waters, who's a co-founder of Pink Floyd. They've accused him of anti-Semitism over a recent performance in Germany. So Waters has come under criticism for a May 17th show in Berlin where he donned an outfit that resembled a Nazi uniform, which is part of a performance of the legendary Pink Floyd album, The Wall. In response to the criticism, Waters released a statement that said the elements of the show he was criticized for are clearly a statement in opposition to fascism, injustice, and bigotry. He said, quote, attempts to portray these elements as something else are disingenuous. and politically motivated. The depiction of an unhinged fascist demagogue has been a feature of my show since Pink Floyd's The Wall in 1980, end quote. So yeah, it's a performance he's been doing for decades and decades. And the reason why this happened, why he was smeared like this, is because he is supportive of Palestinian rights and he's been critical of the Israeli government. You know, he's often falsely accused of being an anti-Semite by people, but you know, this is the U.S. State Department doing it. U.S. officials think that Putin might only use a nuke if he feels cornered or if his control of Crimea is threatened. And despite that assessment, you know, it's interesting. One of the few things U.S. officials think Putin might use a nuke over is losing control of Crimea. But they're also supporting Ukrainian attacks on Crimea. You know, Victoria Nuland said explicitly that the U.S. supports Ukrainian attacks on Crimea. And Jake Sullivan recently reaffirmed, this has been said by multiple U.S. officials, that their restrictions, you know, they asked Ukraine not to use American weapons on Russian territory, but that doesn't apply to Crimea. And so really what, you know, we get from this is that the Biden administration's lack of concern about escalating the war appears to be based only on the fact that Putin has not taken action against NATO up to this point. But it's very clear that as this war drags out and the U.S. and NATO increase support for Ukraine, it's going to make a direct clash between NATO and Russia more likely. Which, even though the U.S. is doing all this in Ukraine with Russia, still the Pentagon and all the other government agencies do say China is the top priority. And the next one here, Indo-Pacific Command, says that the U.S. is ready to fight and win a war with China. This is a story from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute, and this is more, another example of the U.S. military, U.S. officials openly discussing preparing for a direct war with China, not a proxy war, a direct war. So the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral John Aquilino, he highlighted the military's threatening posture toward China, speaking at the annual meeting of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations last month, which is interesting because that group is known for encouraging engagement between the U.S. and China. And yet another confirmation that the White House has overturned the long-standing strategic ambiguity policy regarding Taiwan. Aquilino went so far as to say President Joe Biden and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin have tasked him to win a war against China if Beijing attacks the island. So he said, quote, "What I can tell you is that the Secretary and the President have tasked me with two missions. The first is to prevent this conflict. And then the second one is, if I fail at mission one, to be ready and prepared to fight and win. The United States military is manned, trained, equipped, postured, and ready to execute both of those missions," end quote. So again, you know, it's just very unsettling to hear all this rhetoric.
I can't
by the way, that this COVID war has done is incalculable.
Yes.
Not only economically, but mentally, spiritually, physically. All the data is there. Crime rates skyrocketing. I mean, there was never this thing where, stores closing down because of high crime rates before this happened. Now you're seeing the drug overdose numbers, the suicide rates, the obesity rates, on and on. Now another study came out because they had masks on. Little kids, now the kids are having trouble talking as they're growing up because they weren't able to speak freely as kids. I mean, it's the damage that's been done. But I'm mentioning this because, again, our liberty and freedom was robbed from us from politicians who made up laws based on political science, not real science.
Well, they made up their own rules. No legislature, not the New York legislature, not the New Jersey legislature, not the U.S. Congress, no legislature ordered any lockdown whatsoever. These were all diktats ordered by, to some extent, Trump, but for the most part by the governors of the states. And we all, not you and I, but 90% of the public caved like a nation of sheep.
Yep.
And now that, as you pointed out, is bearing fruit. It has resulted in lack of mature intellectual, cultural development on the part of children. And for some reason, the crime rate has spiked.
And it seems like week after week when we meet, it's always another level of how we become not the United States of America, but the USSA, the United Soviet States of America. And your article here, that state secrets undermine due process, really exemplifies that.
Well, it's hard to believe, and Gerald, always a pleasure to be on with you, my dear friend. It's hard to believe that in a courtroom of the United States of America, the prosecutor has a buzzer on his table, and if he suspects that the defense lawyer is going to say something that's a secret, he gets to press the buzzer, silence his adversary, the public can't hear what's going on, and the judge admonishes defense counsel not to say what he was about to say. Now, this is a procedure that was used in the old Soviet Union when the Soviets wanted to frustrate a criminal defense lawyer, but this is happening. Now, it's Guantanamo Bay, but it's a federal courtroom under federal law with a federal judge, with a federal prosecutor, with a military defense counsel being stifled. And what was the military defense counsel talking about? Where and how my client was tortured and why he was locked up for 20 years before they even brought charges against him. And this is what he was prevented and stifled from saying. My point is not that the defendant is a good person, but that if this can happen in an American courtroom to this guy, we should all know about it and be aware of it, because it is just one more baby step of the government crushing liberty, the liberty of the press to know what's going on, the First Amendment, the liberty of the defendant to have due process rights, a fair proceeding against him, and the liberty of the defendant to have his Sixth Amendment rights, which is effective assistance of counsel. If the prosecutor can silence the defense lawyer, then the defendant does not have effective assistance of counsel, and that right has been violated. The danger with a protracted war like this is a couple of dangers here. As recently as 6 days ago, Secretary of State Blinken, speaking in Helsinki, reiterated the American nonsense that Putin is losing, Putin's going to lose, and we're in this war. We're there to back the Ukrainians for as long as it takes.
Yep.
They have no exit ramp. They have no way out of it. What does a protracted war mean? It eventually, look at history, it eventually leads to escalation, to heavier military equipment and the involvement of more people. When Viktor Orban, the president or the prime minister of Hungary, which is a member of NATO, was asked, why are you opposed to this? And he said, well, my heart goes out for the Ukrainian people, but this is not a war that they can win. this war should end immediately, and I'm not going to lift a finger to extend the war. I don't want Russian boys to die any more than I want Ukrainian boys to die. The questioner says, what about NATO? Orban, look at the facts. NATO's heart is not in this. If it were, you'd see NATO troops on the ground, and you don't.
Now, there are many obvious examples of change to which he could appeal: landslides, volcanoes, earthquakes, biological growth, the slow changes of erosion, and so on. But you might ask, well, what would a follower of Heraclitus do with such a thing as this lectern? Now, this seems the most peaceful, quiet, motionless, unchanging thing you could ask for. It just sits there. What's happening? Well, Heraclitus might personally have had a little difficulty with it, but his followers don't bat an eye when you give them an example of that sort, because they say, well, looked at from your crude human senses, it looks like it is motionless. But if you could see it as modern science reveals it to us, you would see that this table is a holocaust of activity. There's all sorts of subatomic particles busily racing off and onto it, all the boundary interchanges. And there are electric charges coursing through it, and energy pulsations and cosmic rays, and you can, get any cheap science fiction and put in whatever you want there. The idea being that actually this table is a whirl of activity, this lecture, and it simply is the crudeness of human senses that makes this activity undetectable to us. But that simply is the defect of our senses. We can therefore, however, confidently generalize and say that everything, even the most apparently stationary things, are constantly changing.
Zelensky receives a powerful offer on F-16s. So Zelensky said on Tuesday that Ukraine has received a powerful offer from countries that are willing to provide their American-made F-16 fighter jets. So since President Biden approved the delivery of the F-16s from Europe to Ukraine, which he did at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan, but since then, it has not been clear which countries will send the jets. European nations that are expected to arm Ukraine with their F-16s include the Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark, but they have not yet made a commitment. But Zelensky signaled that a deal on the aircraft will be reached soon. He said, quote, "Our partners know how many aircraft we need. I have already received an understanding of the number from some of our European partners. It is a serious, powerful offer," end quote. So the Ukrainian leader said that he was waiting for a final agreement, including a joint agreement with the United States. So the U.S. has not made a final decision on whether or not it will send its own F-16. So the Biden administration is leaving open the possibility, because Biden has really said he's going to approve the export of F-16s from European countries to Ukraine, which is required for them to send them. But, again, the U.S. is also, they might send their own F-16s as well. So on Monday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov noted that F-16s can carry nuclear weapons, and he warned that sending them to Ukraine was a major escalation. And the White House responded to Lavrov's comments, and the White House brushed them off. And this is White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. He said, quote, "The first thing I would say to Minister Lavrov is, if you're worried about Ukrainian military capabilities, then you should take your troops and leave Ukraine," end quote. The FBI helps Ukraine censor Twitter users and obtain their info. So the FBI aided a Ukrainian intelligence effort to ban Twitter users and collect their data. New leaks show Twitter declined to censor journalists targeted by Ukraine, which included Aaron Mate. He was on the list. So this is based on leaked emails. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has aided a Ukrainian intelligence effort to censor social media users and obtain their personal information. In March 2022, an FBI special agent sent Twitter a list of accounts on behalf of the Security Service of Ukraine. That's the SBU, Ukraine's main intelligence agency. The accounts, the FBI wrote, were suspected by the SBU in spreading fear and disinformation. In an attached memo, the SBU asked Twitter to remove the accounts and hand over their user data. The Ukrainian government's FBI-enabled targets extend to members of the media. Again, Aaron was one of the people on this list. So what was interesting is that the FBI censorship request was relayed in a March 27th email in 2022 from an FBI special agent, and the assistant legal attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev was also on the email, and it was sent to 2 Twitter executives, and 4 FBI colleagues were copied on the exchange. So, but as of, it doesn't look like Twitter obliged with their request. According to a new study, a majority of Europeans would prefer their countries to stay neutral if the United States and China go to war over Taiwan. So just 23% of people across 11 countries would want to take the U.S.'s side, with 62% wanting to stay neutral. The poll was part of a study by the European Council on Foreign Relations, which shows that many European citizens, 43%, continue to view China as a necessary partner with whom they would like to cooperate more than any other category. So much different than the polls you see in the U.S. I think it's interesting. The U.S. is trying to lead these NATO countries, into the Asia Pacific, but they're getting resistance from France specifically, as we went over the other day, that France looks like they might block NATO opening an office in Japan. Macron has spoken out, says he doesn't want to follow the U.S. into a conflict with China. So I think, it's good to see resistance to these policies. And it's not even clear that if Japan or, the U.S. allies in the region want to get involved in all this as well. I mean, they're clearly building up their military and going along with the military exercises. But when it comes to committing to actually going to war over Taiwan, I don't think we've seen them do that. The U.S., I guess, has not officially done that, but President Biden has said multiple times that he will intervene if China attacks Taiwan. And again, the military leaders are saying that they're going to go to war directly with China over Taiwan if war breaks out.
Now, from this point, Heraclitus drew a momentously important consequence. He drew the consequence that there are no things at all. No entities. Now, an entity means essentially a thing. For example, a table, a person, a mountain, a cigarette, a plant. Now, to the normal person, it seems blatantly obvious that there are all kinds of things, all kinds of entities. But Heraclitus observed that if you accept his principle, that everything is changing in every respect, at every instant, there are no entities.
But there's sort of a big issue going on right now, and it's affected the entire country almost, but especially in the Northeast, and that is there's smoke all over the place, and we're going to try to sort all this out. Who caused this smoking? Are they smoking too many cigarettes or too much marijuana? Maybe the interpretation of what's going on, they might be smoking something that causes them to come across, because it's so simple for those people who think that mankind, civilization causes all these problems, and therefore it's up to government to solve them, because they're in the business of building up government. That is the goal. So that's what's going on now. Where in the world did this come from, and all this fire? And it's probably worse than average, might be one of the worst, and we understand that. But the first thing I look at when we see problems like this is who owns it? Whose property is it? Who's messing up? Could it have been prevented? Well, there's a lot you can't prevent. This idea that we as a people can control the weather, and the radicals say, yes, you can. It's all caused by mankind. It's global warming, and it's also climate change. They quit saying it's too hot. There's climate warming, and therefore it's all due to what the government. They dropped that because they couldn't prove that the globe was actually getting warmer. So they sort of dropped that. So they talk about climate change and climate control, and that's a little bit more vague, and they can attack. And then they come up and say, well, it's CO2. And they would say that CO2 is like 99, the way I hear them talk, 99% of the problem. Too much CO2, too much civilization, and that is the problem. I don't think it's that simple. I believe very strongly in pollution control, and we've had a lot of advancements made by that, and that I think is good.
Government, they really do ruin whatever they interfere with. That's why government is meant to be restrained by the Constitution. But boy, did it break those chains, and now it just runs wild. And you could just go through any list of, look what they did to healthcare. I mean, it's such a disgrace in this country. But government, it invaded the industry, and in league with the corporations and with the so-called agencies, FDA, CDC, they ruined it. Student loans, education, everybody knows how bad government schools are, but look at student loans. They were going to make it more accessible, more affordable. Did the exact opposite, drove up the price, and everybody's buried in debt, and now people who didn't take on the debt are expected to pay for it. Foreign policy, COVID, we could just go down a list all day long. So we are supposed to think that this organization is going to manage the weather? I mean, I don't even know how you get to that point. Why would you think that they could do such a thing?
But the contest is between those individuals now who are becoming more numerous, saying, no, this is proof pudding that big government is maybe the big problem that we have, and we ought to deal with it. And we always should be looking more for the solutions coming from private property ownership and peace and prosperity, which means that people should be, owning land and dealing with their problems. And maybe that's far superior to this authoritarian approach that we're using right now. Chris.
Very good, Dr. Paul. I will finish up more on a philosophical note. But it's what we talk about. It's the role of government. And, there is a flawed mentality out there, mostly from the left, sometimes from the right, in this belief of perfection and that government progresses us with its laws and it can be used to perfect humanity. And it's just not true. Humans are imperfect, always will be. We cannot create perfection. No tool that we create can create perfection either, because we're imperfect. We're not going to create the perfect tool either. So government is out as far as perfecting society and AI and anything else that we create. But we can improve. We can do better today than we did yesterday individually. We can do better tomorrow than we do today. But we can never be perfect because we're always ignorant. We're always dissatisfied with something. We come into conflicts with other people. We may want the same thing. We may want a thing to be used our way, whereas someone wants it used their way. So conflict is a permanent part of our life here. But those progressives, they just believe just write another law. No matter what happens, you'll see them, just write another law. But the counterintuitive part of that is that more laws create more conflict. They have so many laws right now that they can't even enforce them. They probably don't even know most of them exist. They just go look them up and see if it's convenient to use it at the moment. So more laws will not perfect society either, even though this is their goal, and that's why they always constantly fail. Our goal is freedom. Freedom is better. Freedom does not create perfection. We will not be perfect with freedom. People will still be grumpy, unhappy, dissatisfied, but it's much, much better than this authoritarianism that we live under because, these small groups of people make decisions for everybody and then everybody has to suffer.
Now, how does this follow? Well, in essence, he says, try and find me an entity. In reality, remember, which is constantly changing. You point to this lectern and say, there it is. But you no sooner got the it out, the T is still being pronounced, and it's gone completely, the lectern. It's vanished in the flux. It's completely different from what it was. Nothing stands still for one instant. Therefore, try to find something and say, there's a thing, and you just get to that and the thing is gone. And therefore, Heraclitus summarized in two famous aphorisms, which are two of his fragments. Nothing is, everything is becoming, which is surely a paradoxical utterance. And the other famous one is panta re, in other words, everything flows and nothing abides.
So checkmate. I just proved you have a terrible policy here of not nuking Russia because that's what Vladimir Putin wants. You see what I'm saying? What a ridiculous standard that is. Like that's what if we didn't invade Iraq in 2003, that's giving Saddam what he wants. Someone's always going to get what they want. What should matter is what do we want? Like that should be the standard. And the standard should be what is in the interest of peace and what is in the defense of America. That should be the standard for war policy. Like that's it. The Nova Kakhovka Dam, located in southern Ukraine, right near the Dnipro River, was destroyed. It is, as of right now, both sides are blaming the other one. Russia's claiming that Ukraine did it. Ukraine is claiming that Russia did it. It seems to be a real disaster. A real environmental disaster and a real disaster for people in the surrounding areas. And anyway, it is not entirely clear to me as of right now who's responsible for this. It is interesting how all of the usual suspects are jumping to blame Russia for it. I'm just a little bit skeptical to accept that, particularly after the Nord Stream pipeline was attempted to be blamed on Russia. Everyone's walked back from that now. The rockets that launched that hit Poland were blamed on Russia. Then it was confirmed that it wasn't in fact Russian, it was Ukrainian. Who knows? As of right now, it seems that most of the experts are saying that this is going to probably hurt Russia more than it's going to hurt the Ukrainians because the water supply in Crimea is now in jeopardy. Although there does seem to be, it seems as though this was Russian-controlled area. There was the beginning of a counteroffensive launched by the Ukrainians. It's possible, too, that this will hurt them and slow down their counteroffensive. So I don't exactly know, but it's certainly one more reminder that war is really, really bad. And instead of doing everything that our government could do to provoke this conflict and then everything our government could do to prolong this conflict and keep funneling weapons into it, probably would have been better to be striving for peace this whole time. It was completely common when reporters were talking about Osama bin Laden to talk about how he hated America for our foreign policy in the Middle East. Like that was the line. But then as soon as 9/11 happened, it was like that was a controversial thing to say now. Like it was like, no, he hates us for our freedom. And then if someone was like, I think it's our foreign policy, they'd be like, you hate America or whatever. And it's the same thing now that this was reported. You could find, I don't remember a specific piece off the top of my mind, but I guarantee you, like if I went and did a Nexus search on the New York Times, you could find reports about Ukrainian Nazis, just not since Russia invaded. As soon as Russia invaded, that became a Russian talking point. But this was, people knew about this forever. This has always been a thing. There's very radical elements. And George H.W. Bush gave a speech right before the fall of the Soviet Union, where he was basically saying, and I believe that, I'm not sure if the speech was in Ukraine, but it definitely he had Ukraine in his mind. But he was talking about how, look, we may be opposed to the Soviet Union, but don't think we're with you guys, like ethno-nationalists who want to break away. Like, this has been a concern that people have known about forever. This isn't anything new, but it's just funny that, like, as soon as Vladimir Putin invaded, that became the thing you're not allowed to talk about. And we must pretend it doesn't exist. And so now they have to admit it exists, but, you know, it's just thorny. It's just, look, we'll admit it's a thorny history. The problem here, the real problem with the Nazis is they could make Vladimir Putin look good. That's the real issue, not their plans to exterminate the Jews or whatever. Anyway, that's pretty insane.
Everything flows and nothing abides. Now, some of you have heard me read from a commentator who actually makes this point clear. And says the only time I've ever found this particular point made unequivocally clear, I'm going to take a moment to read you a fairly lengthy passage from one historian who outdid himself in the presentation of this point. And since it's a very important point, hear him on this point. He's a modern commentator summarizing Heraclitus' view. I could not equal this level of clarity on this point. Quote, all things flow. No man can ever step twice into the same river. How could he? The second time he tried to step, new waters would have flowed down from upstream. The waters would not be the same. Neither would the bed and the banks be the same, for the constant erosion would have changed them too. And if the river is the water, the bed and the banks, the river is not the same river. Strictly speaking, there is no river. When people talk about a river, they suppose that a name applies to something that will remain there for a time at least. But the river remains there no time at all. It has changed while you pronounce its name. There is no river. Worse yet, you cannot step into the same river twice because you are not there twice. You too change, and the person who stepped the first time no longer exists to step the second time. Persons do not exist. When anyone says that something exists, the meaning is that that something does not change, at least for a short time. An object that is real must be an object that stands still.
I've actually seen the emojis becoming real life, sad to say. In my own area, I live in southern Middle Tennessee, and it is, I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, but you know what? I grew up in a culture where it was not uncommon to see a Confederate flag. They exist in the world, particularly in this part of the country. And it's weird to me. It's almost surreal to be driving down the street and see vehicles with Confederate flags on them and Ukraine flags. And I'm like, how on earth did this happen? What is your mental process to put that sticker on your truck? I've seen them.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there, honestly. I'll take the most unfashionable position of all, and then I'll take Anderson Cooper's position, and I'll just have them side by side.
Well, adding to that point, something that I've talked about before, and I don't remember if I've even brought it up with you or on the show before, is I'm sure you recall the sort of pseudo meme internet phenomenon of people saying Epstein didn't kill himself. And I don't want to get into that whole topic because we've got plenty of other stuff.
I have nothing to say on it other than I'm suspicious like everybody, but I have no information on it.
Sure. The reason I bring that up is that there was a lot of people saying that. There was a lot of people that you wouldn't say are natural allies of us ideologically who were saying, oh, no, there's more to that story than meets the eye. And so they're parroting this statement. And the reason I bring that up is that I guess what kind of disappointed me about the whole thing is that you have a high number of people mimicking that phrase, which is a good thing. Because if you wipe away the meme of it, it's people saying, I don't trust the official position that CNN is telling me about what happened about this historical event. That's refreshing. But then those same people who will have that in their profile then were hook, line, and sinker for every major news story that happened since then. And I think it just falls flat for those folks. Those folks, on one hand, say, I don't believe the narrative on this particular story, but they still believe the regime as a whole, if that makes sense.
I'll dwell on that. Everybody makes mistakes. What kind of person are you? And these are the same people who accuse everyone else on earth of being xenophobic. But of course, they are wonderful lovers of mankind. But yet, if Bush had deliberately killed 1 million Americans, probably they would say that was a bad thing. And they would not say, I long for the days of George W. Bush. But Iraqis, well, they're not Americans. They're stupid towelheads. They don't count. That's the way they think. At least I can't imagine any other way you could rationalize saying that George W. Bush was a good guy and if only we could have him back. The people they strongly dislike, whether it's anybody from Trump to Thomas Massey to even Marjorie Taylor Greene, oh, they cannot stand these people. These people are not responsible for 1 million deaths. But since the 1 million deaths aren't Americans, nobody cares. Nobody cares. We'll take this mass murderer. We long for those days when the establishment got along really well and the ruling classes got along really well. We didn't have these populist upstarts. I don't understand. It's insane to me.
Well, circling back around to the latest ebook on Ukraine, give us the Reader's Digest version of the particular kind of regime narrative on Ukraine that you felt absolutely 100% had to be smashed. And as sort of kind of a caveat along with that, because I know you're a historian, and so these are things that you've kind of made your bread on, is how much of all of these issues, whether it's Ukraine now, whether it's some of the other books, whether it's you brought up the 2008 crisis, how many of these things can be just boiled down to people think history started 5 minutes ago?
That's
on this particular issue, it just started, like, so with Ukraine, issues with Russia and Ukraine started in 2022, of course.
Right. And that really is what it boils down to, is the history starts 5 minutes ago. Of course, we all saw that with 9/11. And you can understand maybe the first few weeks after 9/11, nobody wants to hear a history lesson. They should, but they don't. And okay, fair enough. But after the first few weeks, we have to talk. Americans, we have to talk about what just happened here. As a matter of fact, just the other night, I was on a longish drive from Orlando to Tampa with my 13-year-old so she could be in a gymnastics competition. And I was so surprised when all of a sudden she said to me, Dad, what was it like to live through 9/11? And I thought, what a smart question to ask.
Wow.
And so I talked to her about where I was and how I found out about it and the immediate aftermath and the uncertainty of the future and all that. But then I enclosed in that a little like Ron Paulian lesson. And I said, someday I'll sit down and I'll give you the whole story. But for now, I think the key thing to bear in mind is I reminded her that it's never morally right to deliberately target innocent people. Doesn't matter how profound your grievances are. That can never, ever be justified. I said, but Ron Paul's point that he tried to make to America was, I'm simply telling you it's a fact that if you intervene in other countries' affairs, you are going to get pushback from that. And that can take very ugly forms. So if you don't want that pushback, you should try to minimize how often you're interfering in the affairs of other countries. And when you put it that way, it doesn't sound treasonous and weird and blame America first or whatever they said about it. It just sounds like common sense. She said, yeah, that makes sense. And I thought, okay, there you go. The point is, if you do certain things, there will be consequences to those things, as there were on 9/11 and as there are here. And in both cases, the foreign policy establishment tried to separate things the West had been doing from the blowback. Oh, we had nothing to do with why there were grievances in the Middle East. We had nothing to do with why people were radicalized in the Middle East. And likewise, nothing we did has anything to do with this Russian response. Well, okay, you can talk and act like that if you want to. But again, that's falling into the history started 5 minutes ago. So,
well, I think what frustrates a lot of people, the people who are already on the side of this whole thing was a sham, is that you're starting to see, in the same way that everyone today was magically against the war in Iraq, when we all know that they were totally for it 20 years ago, but everyone magically today says, oh, well, I was always against the war in Iraq. You're starting to see that already now. You're starting to see some of the mainstream media will occasionally put out an article saying, oh, well, here's some questionable data on this particular point, or, oh, well, there certainly have been some adverse reactions to this vaccine. Who could have ever guessed that that could possibly happen? And I think that that's what really boils people's blood, because then people are saying, yeah, I know, I said that 16 months ago, and then I lost my job and I had all my accounts deleted and my bank shut down my bank account and I had to withdraw my money, assuming I could get it, depending on where in the world you lived at the time. So I think all of that distills down to people always want there to be consequences for the ruling class's actions.
Yeah.
But sadly, that almost is never the case. And so perhaps the next best thing is you just lay out the case in the hopes that they don't go down the rabbit hole the next time.
It really is incredible that nobody's ever called to account. And it's one of the poisons of nationalism that it makes us feel less empathy for people elsewhere in the world. Now, I'm not saying you have equal empathy for every human being on earth, because that's inhuman. Your heart is only so large. I don't have the same care for somebody on the other side of the world as I do for my own child. That I get. But at the same time, I don't just callously disregard a terrible atrocity occurring to somebody else. And yet, for some reason, I think a lot of Americans do. Because there should be executions taking place in the U.S. of war criminals over what was done to Iraq. I mean, there should be extremely harsh punishments, because if this was done, if you killed that many people for what we know you obviously knew was no good reason, and it was in this country, you would be made an example of in the history books. You'd be shunned by everybody, and that would be the end of it. Whereas George W. Bush can hobnob among the elites of the world still to this day and be welcomed and treated with respect and cheered on by people. And if he wants to write an op-ed for the New York Times, they'll happily publish it. It's like it never happened.
Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq. Anyway.
So nothing happens to him because the people he committed his crimes against lived all the way over there. And if it's all the way over there, then, that doesn't really count.
Suppose a clever sculptor takes a lump of children's modeling clay and begins to work it rapidly. It shortly takes on the appearance of the child's teddy bear. And if the sculptor should stop, we could call it a teddy bear. But he doesn't stop. His nimble fingers keep working, and the momentary bear turns into a small statue of Zeus, only quickly to disappear into the form of the Empire State Building. Well, what is it, you ask? The answer is not that it's a bear, or a god, or a building. Under these circumstances, all we could say is that it's modeling clay. And we could call it clay because the clay remains the same throughout the changes. But if the clay itself never remained the same, if it changed from clay to wax to paper mache and so on and never stopped changing, we could call it nothing. Nothing. That is, it does not exist. It is unreal. Unquote.
So the End Endless Wars Act was introduced by Senators Rand Paul, Mike Lee, J.D. Vance, and Mike Braun. The legislation would repeal the 2001 AUMF 180 days after its enactment. So Senator Paul said in a statement, quote, "If there exists any desire to reclaim our constitutional power and send a message to the world that we are a nation of peace, Congress should pass this bill and repeal the 2001 authorization for war. After all, the 2001 AUMF never intended to authorize a worldwide war all the time, everywhere, forever," end quote. Russia says that it repelled a large Ukrainian attack. So Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said Thursday that Russian forces repelled a Ukrainian attack in Ukraine's southern Zaporozhye Oblast, as Western media outlets are reporting that Ukraine's counteroffensive has officially begun. So Shoigu said that at 1:30 a.m. early Thursday morning, Ukraine made an attempt with up to 1,500 troops and 150 pieces of armor from the 47th Mechanized Brigade to break through Russian defenses. He said that this assault was halted and that Ukraine retreated with heavy casualties. He said that Ukraine lost 30 tanks, 11 infantry fighting vehicles, and up to 350 personnel. And, there's no way to confirm those numbers. And Ukrainian leadership is also keeping quiet about its offensive plans. Russian official says that the U.S. pressured Ukraine not to sign a peace deal. So this is Nikolai Patrushev. He is the secretary of the Russian Security Council. On Thursday, he said that Ukraine was ready to sign a peace deal with Russia in the early days of the war, but gave up on negotiations due to U.S. pressure. He said, quote, "Had it not been for the U.S. pressure on those whom they installed at the head of Ukraine, this situation would not have happened. Even the Ukrainian leaders themselves were ready for signing a peace treaty and gave Russia written proposals that we, in principle, approved," end quote. He said that there are interested parties interested in continuing this conflict, mainly the U.S. and the U.K. The U.S. dismisses a report on a Chinese spy base in Cuba. So on Thursday, there was this very scary sounding report from the Wall Street Journal that claimed China and Cuba have reached an agreement to establish a secret Chinese spying facility in Cuba. So this grabbed a lot of headlines, but the Pentagon, both the Pentagon and the White House, have dismissed it, calling it not accurate. So Pentagon spokesman Brigadier General Patrick Ryder said, quote, "I can tell you based on the information that we have that is not accurate, that we are not aware of China and Cuba developing a new type of spy station. In terms of that particular report, no, it's not accurate," end quote. So the Wall Street Journal, they cited anonymous U.S. officials who claimed that China would provide Cuba with billions of dollars as part of the agreement to build an eavesdropping station. The officials claimed that the facility would allow China to gather signals intelligence, known as SIGINT, which could include the monitoring of emails, phone calls, and satellite transmissions. The Soviet Union had a spy station in Cuba throughout the Cold War that was established in 1962, known as the Lord's Sigint Station. It was closed by Russia in 2002. That's just a little history, because I've seen some people try to compare this, believing the Wall Street Journal report, trying to compare it to the Cuban Missile Crisis, to the, similar to nuclear weapons being sent to Cuba, which is just nonsense. So I think it's just important to point out that the Soviets did have some kind of spying station there. After that. So Bob Menendez, who is the hawkish chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he said that if China establishes a spy facility in Cuba, it would be a direct assault upon the United States. And of course, any Chinese surveillance efforts in the region would be a response to the U.S. constantly running surveillance operations near China, including frequent spy plane flights over the South China Sea.
And so now we've got China saying that they're going to put military bases, or not a military base, I guess some sort of a spy base down at Cuba. And now I'm not, like I said, this isn't me. I'm not war mongering against China. I'm a filthy old dirty hippie who thinks everyone can just get along with everybody and trade and just be in love because it would all be good as long as we all understood value and that we all win by not robbing and go to war with each other. Because I'm just a dumb hippie. But I'm just saying from the perspective of these neocons who think that we got to go around policing the world. You're throwing people out of the store while you were robbing them. Just keep robbing them. And then, you know, you're not going to be able to fight both these people at the same time. Like this, you might have been able to oppose. So how's this strategy working out for you? With that being said, I mean, it looks like we're setting ourselves up for some Cold War action where they're going to be telling us we got to get under our beds because don't talk, China can hear you. Like at least when over COVID, we were able to all go online, talk to each other virtually and a whole bunch. But then on this next round, it's not even, I mean, like how dumb was it? We might go to nuclear war and so you have kids going under their desk for nuclear drills. Like going under your desk is going to help you in somehow in a nuclear attack. I don't know. I guess maybe buildings shake and so the building can crumble, but you won't get blasted by radiation or consumed in some giant fireball collapse. No, you're just scaring the shit out of people. I assume that's what they were doing, trying to make sure that they remember that Russia is an evil adversary, and we got to indoctrinate the kids that if the government didn't exist, you would be consumed by a fire, because that's what's healthy for kids, is when every single day they got to get under their desks, because, hey, remember, our world leaders, they like to butt heads with their world leaders about resources and wealth that will never be in your pockets. These are fights that have nothing to do with you. But, hey, tensions might get hot between the egos of these two world leaders, so you little young boy or lad, we need you to get out under your desk and be frightened and scared sick so you continue to have full faith in your government that may or may not actually provoke the exact problem that will kill you. But remember, the other people, they're more evil. Feels like we're setting that shit up with China, huh? Oh my God, they're in Cuba and they're listening to our calls. I mean, I don't like anyone listening to our calls, but I don't know. Is it worse if China's listening to my calls than the U.S. Government's listening to my calls?
If the KGB had access to people during the Cold War, the way modern United States has access to us, we would say, oh my gosh, you have taken away your country's freedom. We're the leaders of the free world and you guys have imprisoned your entire population. Oh my gosh. The KGB would give their right arm to have the monitoring devices that are actively in place here in the United States today. We know where you are. We know how long you stayed there. We have records of it. We know what street you were walking on. We don't necessarily monitor it, but we can dig it up if we have to. And with facial recognition, I can track you wherever you are.
I feel like there was
You use the facial recognition. I use it now. It doesn't care if I'm wearing a hat or sunglasses. It still knows who the hell I am.
Surprising good news. The U.S. and Iran may be close to an interim nuclear deal. So this is according to a report from Middle East Eye. Several outlets have reported something similar at this point. And it said that the U.S. and Iran are near a deal that would reduce Iran's uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief, although it's not certain if a final agreement will be reached. So sources told Middle East Eye that direct talks between U.S. and Iranian officials have been taking place on U.S. soil, which is significant because during the earlier rounds of negotiations that fell apart last year, they were indirect. They were basically being brokered by the EU in Vienna, but this is direct talks on U.S. soil. Significant. President Biden's special envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, has been leading the U.S. delegation, and Iran's delegation has been led by the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. The Middle East Eye report said that the U.S. was not interested in restoring the original 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, but an interim agreement is on the table. And the deal would involve Iran stopping enriching uranium at 60%, so they would stop doing that. Iran would also have to continue cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which they've been doing. And, despite the talking points from the U.S. and Israel, Iran is very transparent about their nuclear program. Unlike Israel, who has a secret nuclear weapons program, the Iranians, again, are just very transparent, and they've been trying to cooperate with the IAEA. In exchange for these Iranian steps, the U.S. would allow Iran to export up to 1 million barrels of oil per day. No deal on Iran will tie Israel's hands. And this is by Connor Freeman. At the Libertarian Institute, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned Antony Blinken that no deal the U.S. makes with Iran would prevent Israel from attacking the country over its nuclear program. American and Iranian officials are reportedly engaging in direct negotiations, which I just went over. So Israel is strongly opposed to the JCPOA and basically any deal with Iran, even though they're always complaining about their nuclear activity, the uranium enrichment. And Connor points out that Iran started enriching uranium at 60% in response to Israel bombing their Natanz nuclear facility. They placed explosives in there. That was in April 2021. That was an attempt to sabotage negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. And in response, Iran took the step to increase enrichment to 60%. So all these things Israel complains about is in direct response to things that to them trying to use force against Iran. So, it's just hard to believe that they actually care. All right. So the last one here is some very bad news. British High Court rejects Assange's appeal request. This is from Kevin Gostelow over at The Dissenter. So the United Kingdom's High Court of Justice rejected WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's appeal against extradition to the United States. A 3-page decision was issued by one judge, Sir Jonathan Swift. Assange waited in detention in His Majesty's Belmarsh prison for nearly a year. The grounds for appeal were submitted to the appeals court in the middle of July 2022. So very long time. And Gostelow quotes some lawyers who say, it shouldn't have taken this long. But so this is just not good news. This is basically one step closer to Assange being extradited to the U.S. So Stella Assange, who was Julian Assange's wife, put out a statement on what the next step is going to be. It looks like they're going to try another appeal. So she said in a statement, quote, "On Tuesday next week, my husband, Julian Assange, will make a renewed application for appeal to the High Court. The matter will then proceed to a public hearing before 2 new judges at the High Court, and we remain optimistic that we will prevail and that Julian will not be extradited to the United States, where he faces charges that could result in him spending the rest of his life in a maximum security prison for publishing true information that revealed war crimes committed by the U.S. government," end quote. And that's why they're going after him, because he exposed information. They're trying to put him away for 175 years using the Espionage Act for doing journalism. And if he is convicted of this, it's going to set the most dangerous precedent for press freedom, for freedom in general in the U.S. and around the world, because, the U.S. and the U.K. are in cahoots on this, trying to put Assange away. And I don't think Australia is doing much about it. Their prime minister says that he is, but they're also going along with all this stuff, this military buildup against China. They have real leverage that they could use against the U.S. that I don't think they are.
Nothing is, everything is becoming. Change is the world stuff. Now, this sort of philosophy is called a process philosophy, because it holds that process, activity, motion, change is reality. Now, do not take this superficially to mean merely that he thinks a lot of things are happening in the world. That a lot of things are happening in the world is not a philosophic viewpoint. That is a Reader's Digest homily. The Heraclitean view is that all that exists is change. A stream of shifting, restless, transitory, seething, boiling, bubbling, melting, fusing, swirling activity, riddled with contradictions, as though the whole universe were plunged in a kind of cosmic mixmaster and just simply flowed in all directions. And of course didn't flow because,
I think personal associations are very important, like-minded people getting together. And I think you saw an explosion of that when the people started getting very disgusted with the lockdown. Parents started saying, hey, this isn't good for my kids. And all of a sudden they started coming out, and they are coming out, even though the woke movement has not diminished. It's still there. They're determined, and they use more force and intimidation, more removal of our rights, and even to the point where hardly anybody in America now believes the Department of Justice really gives us justice. It's seen in the political sense. You have 2 factions that choose to believe one group versus the other. There's so little respect for the Constitution. Over the years, there was a lot more respect. Even the schools did a better job. But now there's no respect for all. So my goal would be to get people to understand that and then do something. And what they can do is opt out. And that is exactly what a lot have done over COVID. They started resisting. And peaceful resistance is the answer for libertarians and to avoid the violence. But the other side depends 100% on the violent movement, power of government, imprisonment and punishment and all these things. But we have to realize that ideas are more powerful than weaponry. And unfortunately, there's a long struggle to overcome that. So dealing in ideas, because ideals have an appeal, I'm convinced in the long term, the ideas of liberty, peace, and prosperity that follow along in advancing those causes that we were given with the revolution will prevail. But predicting that next month it's going to happen or next year is a different story. We're going to have to go through a wringing out, which we're hitting to, and we keep propping it up. But eventually, we will have to, reinstitute a system. But the The opposition knows this, and that's why the Marxists are very much involved in destroying culture, because they believe that it can be replaced, by government only by first destroying anything left of the republic. So it's a big challenge, but I would say it is not the end. I mean, if the right ideas are put out there and convince the people that the changes can happen and we can move in a much better direction towards peace and prosperity than this forever warmongering that we have.
Yes, sir, Dr. Paul. This next question is my personal favorite, and it comes from Mike Decentralized. What is the best way for those who value individual liberty to push back against the increasingly overt dystopia?
Well, that's not easy, because everybody has to do it any way they can think of. But to me, the most important thing is understanding the economic fundamentals that bring us to this situation, and why the people go along with it. Well, I mentioned it already. One thing is they make it so that if you don't go along with it, you're not patriotic. If you don't go to all these wars, you're unpatriotic. Even the Middle Eastern wars that under Bush that I strongly opposed, that even convinced a lot of Americans that they were good. And yet we were there in Iraq for 20 years, and we're still there, and we're still, in many ways in Afghanistan, and that was 20 years, and the death and destruction that has gone on. So people have to understand that. They have to understand our foreign policy of interventionism, economic policy, monetary policy. That means education, and you're not going to get it in a government school. Maybe there's a rare government school out there and a rare professor that might teach the truth about economics. But basically, there's not a whole lot of optimism that the government schools would ever teach young people why the government's messing things up. They're not going to do it. They do everything to do the opposite, to put pressure on people to accepting things. So if you have people doing things in the government that we don't like, but they can't report it because they get into trouble, Congress in their wisdom said, well, we'll pass a law to protect whistleblowers. Well, it doesn't work.
Why don't more religions understand hard, sound commodity, money such as gold or Bitcoin? What do you think, Dr. Paul?
Well, I think it's an important question, but I don't want to get into the details and make statements sort of in a theological sense. But in general, I can refer to this because I think it's important, because throughout all of history, thousands of years, some type of a theology always existed, and in a positive way. So out of this, even prior to knowledge about the Ten Commandments, back when the Sumerians had a code, as well as Hammurabi had codes, they were based on something that was subtle, but it was shared by all the great religions. And that is the understanding that there is a higher law. There is a natural law. People can know right and wrong, good and evil. But we're contending with a group of people who are nihilistic.
I would say practically a total basic difference. I'm very anxious to separate objectivism from Nietzsche altogether. The reason for the mistaken rapprochement that some people hold between my philosophy and that of Nietzsche is that Nietzsche has certain very attractive, very wise quotations that purport to uphold individualism, with which one could agree out of context. But accepting his general feel or feeling for individualism, I would not consider Nietzsche an individualist, and above all, he's certainly not an upholder of reason. When you judge a philosophy, you must always start by judging its fundamentals, and in all fundamentals, particularly metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, objectivism not only differs from Nietzsche, but is its opposite, his opposite. Therefore, I do not want to be confused with Nietzsche in any respect.
They philosophically, Nietzsche and others have fundamentally said there is no objective evidence for truth. Truth is unachievable and not understandable. That's their truth, but which is a farce. So no, but the philosophy is you don't know truth, so there's a vacuum. There can be no spiritual truth in the various religions because the nihilists say there is no such thing. I think the nihilists are very, very prevalent in government, especially those who promote lies and wars and all these things. They feel no guilt. They have no remorse about it. They have no shame because they have been conditioned in a psychological way. Well, nobody knows that, so whoever does it, yes, we'll be good. We'll be good dictators. So they don't believe in truth whatsoever. I think that is so important that we recognize this. And it's been around for a long, long time. But I would say that that higher law understanding, the right and wrong that has been taught in so many religions, I think in the last 100 years, it's been usurped by the progressives who have become anti-religion. Today, more and more complaints of people saying, the movement right now is very often construed as being anti-Christian. But I think it's anti-spiritual of those who would say that there is a right and wrong, and they don't want to hear from it. But I'm always amazed at all the evil that is done. And people who are very, very pro-war, and they talk themselves into them to think that they're holier than thou because they're having a war to save love and peace. And it's always to save something, and that's propaganda. Just we have to get people to look at the history, and that to me is the biggest problem. But we shouldn't say that all religions are bad, because sometimes religions go off on a tangent, and they certainly have over the centuries. But most religions, from ancient history all the way back to the Sumerian, they did have a notion. If you look at their codes, they recognized that lying was bad, cheating was bad, killing was bad. Well, that sounds libertarian. That means peaceful things. But they had strict rules against that. But that's a start. And it's been around for a long time. It wasn't invented any one particular year. But it still exists. And I think that war is coming to a climactic end. That is the people who reject a higher law and those who latch themselves onto the justification of nihilism, because you're wasting your time and wasting your energy and you're wasting your money if you think that you can reach something and meet something that is good and something that is bad, and to be able to make a judgment of that. I think that is one of the basic flaws that we have today. But I think that there's still a lot of people becoming more aware of this than ever. And I think people are, when we get a little bit despondent about reporting all the dumb things that our government and the world governments are doing, I always try to remind people, it's not all bad. Some stupid thing that came on, what they're doing to the kids in this multi-genderism and surgeries on 11-year-old kids without parental permission. That is so astounding. But when that message gets out, I think it wakes up thousands of people and say, I didn't know that. I do that. That's atrocious. So I think, the bad stuff that we see out there is horrible, and we should be outraged. But we have to be able to sort out the good from the bad, so that we know exactly how you can. I don't think anybody has access to the perfect definition of right and wrong. But I think the movement, the general thing that you know it and you should strive for it. Goethe, his whole life was spent on trying to get people to strive for the truth, emphasizing that striving for it. And my goal is to think that peace and prosperity is worth striving for. And this is something that I believe is powerful. I'm convinced that the more people that know about it, the more they will join us. So the results of all this and the answers will come from individuals and not originate in the government. Matter of fact, the government right now, as it is composed, is not helping us at all. In our country, unfortunately, I think we're on the downswing. In other countries around the world that had been so abusive of rights seem to be coming around to thinking maybe all that authoritarianism wasn't so hot. So they're shifting gears. But it's ideological, and we have to remember that in a society, truth is treasonous in an empire of lies. So you will hear a lot of lies because we have an empire. And when the conditions improve, we won't have our empire to worry about. And we will be blessed with a lot more liberty and a lot more prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Now, Heraclitus himself, apparently in an attempt to get a metaphor to capture this, picked on fire. Because fire was the closest he seemed to be able to get to the idea of motion without an entity. The tongue's leaping and darting, and yet there's nothing solid there to get a hold of. It seems to be like the visual embodiment of pure motion. And therefore, in that terminology, he said the world stuff is fire. But he did not mean by fire any kind of material substance, but rather sheer process or activity.
And if you want to know how the counteroffensive's going, this is certainly from Week Magazine. The use of these forces and armored vehicles indicates the counteroffensive is underway. That's all they can report to us about the counteroffensive, is that it's officially actually happening. Like as they've spent a whole year declaring victory and talking about how the Russians don't stand a chance to just send us more resources, and then pivoted to, well, it hasn't been going great, but listen, we've got this counteroffensive, and now the reporting on the counteroffensive is that there is a counteroffensive, which sounds to me like it's not going well. I mean, for people that are so quick and wanting to declare victory, and by the way, this is now a better armed and better trained Ukraine. I mean, this is Ukraine with tanks. They should have all the resources they need by now from us to go actually beat the Russians and get going on this counteroffensive. And if you want to know how the world is reporting on this counteroffensive, let's read it again. It is underway. That's where we're at. It's like, the beginning of a race. They just did the thing and the racers are who's winning. It started. Nothing to report yet. And I think I already commented about this on part of the problem, but I love this. This is from Zelensky. Russian terrorists, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wrote on Telegram, the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam only confirms for the whole world that they must be expelled from every corner of Ukrainian land. Russian occupiers blew up the Kakhovka reservoir dam in panic. This terrorist act is a sign of Putin's regime's panic. I mean, firstly, did any of us actually believe that this was Putin in Russia? I don't know. But if it was, I mean, if Putin is losing and he's getting so desperate that he's resulting in acts of terrorism, that he's actually even going to, I guess, make the people living in his region's lives even worse, and nuclear threats are still on the table. I mean, wouldn't you look at that and go, man, this guy's crazy. We better give him what he wants. This thing is going to get so much worse unless we, I mean, that's what you should be saying is, wow. I mean, the guy's actually killing people in his own territories. I don't know if people have died, but he's flooding his own territories and I think destroying his own infrastructure. There's no way we can beat this guy. We better get back to the table and figure out how to de-escalate this. You would think that's what you would say. But hey, there's still more of our money to be spent over there. But now I got actual proof of the fact that government can create government policies that change your prospects for profits at your business. Women-only spa forced to allow trans customer with penises, even though everyone is naked. That's right. Let's read it. A Washington judge has ordered a women-only spa to accept transgender women who still have penises, even though all of its customers are naked. Seattle District Court Judge Barbara Jacobs Rothstein on Monday upheld a discrimination ruling against Olympus Spa filed by local trans activist Heaven Wilvich, who claims to be more women than many feminists who are only incidental. There you go. You got a trans activist. She looks around and she goes, where can I show off my hog to ensure I proudly going where no penis has gone before. I'm going to go find a social club of people with different thoughts and attitudes than me, and I'm going to force them to accept me to ruin their thing. And I'm going to do that in the names of trans rights, because that's what helps everybody get along in society, is when you purposely realize, oh, I can go ruin their thing, and I can complain to the teacher that they won't let me be at their thing. And it's idiot assholes and complainers. It's been a theme I've been talking about on Run Your Mouth podcast for a long time. It's just kindergarten and catering to the complainers and letting them ruin it for everybody. So in this case, he got this one, sees a whole group of people, they're having a nice time, and decides, you know what? It's just being a troll. I can go ruin their nice time because based on the rules of the game, they can't tell me that I can't be there, and then I'll go complain to the teacher, and then they're going to have to let me be there. And so there she is. She goes to the spa, which we're going to continue reading in a second. And she's like, look at my balls, you bigot. Hey, listen, if you're out there and you got a nice hog and you thought that you couldn't just expose yourself to women, all you have to do is, you don't even need to put on a wig. You can shave your head and pretend like you're one of the shaved head peoples. And you can decide that you want to be a male tomorrow. If for one day you just realize you have a really nice hog and you haven't been able to show it to anyone in a while, there you go. You declare yourself a lady. They can't, and they're not allowed to tell yourself that you're not a lady, even if just for one day you want to declare yourself it. I mean, how do they prove that you weren't feeling like a lady for that day? And so then you can go expose yourself, and who knows, maybe you'll even get laid. Maybe the women will sit around and they'll just be like, my God, what a hog you've got. And then the next thing you know, I'm just saying, if you have been living your life and you've been trying to figure out how you might be able to expose your big wiener to Christian women who are naked, this is your in. Government sanctioned. You might have to go out to Washington. Different states work out a little bit differently. But if you want to go expose yourself to some women, you can start hitting up the lady spas and just identifying as a dude and showing off what you got. You can have some fun with this. You don't have to run into the park with the trench coat and do it. You can actually yell at them for being bigots for not appreciating your lady junk. Wilchevich first complained in February 2020, and the Washington State Human Rights Commission later agreed that the Korean spa discriminated against Wilvich based on sexual orientation. I did it, Wilvich had posted at the time, celebrating getting the main naked lady spa in the area to change their policies and allow all self-identified women access regarding of surgery and genitals. Once again, going where no penis has gone before, complaining to the teacher, and making sure that the ladies-only naked spa is a safe place for men to show women their wieners. We salute you, tranny lady.
Now, I may point out that Heraclitus had a follower, many, but one in the ancient world, named Cratylus, Cratylus. I didn't take down his dates, but he was a disciple of Heraclitus and a teacher of Plato, so he's between the two. And he drew a apparently perfectly obvious conclusion from this principle. He stopped talking on principle. He took the view that no one should ever speak, on the grounds that there is no way to give words meaning, because the only way you can give words meaning is by giving them a referent, and there's nothing for words to refer to. If you try to say lectern, by the time you say lek, it's gone. And therefore words are simply noise, and a respectable man does not utter noise. According to Aristotle, from whom we learn about this, Cratylus at a certain point in his conversion therefore stopped speaking and simply wagged his finger when he was hungry, presumably beckoning the non-Heraclitians to bring him food.
So yeah, I was walked to this back room which had no windows. It was extremely hot, and they said that I was being held under Schedule 3 of the 2019 Prevention of Terrorism Act. Now, this is a sweeping bit of legislation. It's not typically used against journalists. They haven't got to that point yet. Maybe I'm the first of a wider trend to come. But in effect, it grants police extraordinary and indeed unprecedented powers in the history of Western quote-unquote democracy, and it robs suspects or interviewees of all sorts of fundamental rights. And so it would have been an arrestable offence to not answer their questions. It would have been an arrestable offence not to hand over my passwords and patterns for unlocking my electronic devices. And I might add, like Britain was the country that invented the right to silence, which, much of the world, to, varying degrees of seriousness, has taken up as a basic legal principle. And at one stage in British history, it was enforced or observed so stringently that it was actually illegal for suspects to testify in their defense at criminal trials, because it was thought improper that anything they said in their defense might be turned against them or taken out of context or twisted. So yes, this is it's quite remarkable. I think the US has the Fifth Amendment, which is the right against self-incrimination. That didn't apply here. I am heartened that so many average private citizens have thought that this is absolutely disgusting. And, they are, particularly outside of the UK, they find the idea that you would not have a right to silence completely shocking. And yes, as I say, Britain is the country that is, the mother of all democracies, that they're amazed by it. People ask me, why didn't you remain silent? Well, I would have been arrested and potentially jailed. So, it's one hell of a trap. And I might add, the wording of the legislation under which I was held is terrifyingly vague and broad, and it has, so for instance, Schedule 3 refers to potential state threats. Now this is, stopping means that they can stop people at UK borders if they feel that this person poses a threat to, poses a state threat or is acting on behalf of a hostile state against British interests. Now, the wording states that an individual doesn't need to know or be consciously acting on behalf of a foreign state to pose a state threat. But not only that, the state who they're acting for doesn't need to know either. So it's one hell of a conspiracy where the two conspirators don't know that they are conspiring with each other in service of a particular goal. Mm-hmm. And it's really, I think that, we're getting into the realm here where, we've had probably the real turning point was, like Russiagate, etc. But we have had years of supposed disinformation experts who are actually just experts in spinning disinformation themselves and censorship, saying that, well, even if someone is unwittingly broadcasting or transmitting or disseminating or amplifying quote unquote Russian disinformation narratives, which could be that the war in Iraq was an illegal war of aggression, according to them, then they are effectively guilty of collaborating in a Russian information operation, even if they're doing so unwittingly, and therefore they are legitimate targets for censorship and much more besides online. Now, this seems to be ever increasingly enshrined in law, where whatever the government says constitutes disinformation becomes so. And not only is, yes, kind of provides a rationale for censorship and other anti-free speech, anti-democratic moves, but could potentially constitute a criminal offence.
Yep. All right. So it's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Kit Clarenberg from thegrayzone.com. And I got a few things on my mind already at this point in the interview, Kit. The first one is that you guys ought to wear this as a badge of honor. You guys do such great work. Max and Aaron, Aaron Mate, of course. I never say it right. It's Aaron Mate. And,
yes.
And your great work, and I'm forgetting the other guy's names off the top of my head, Rubenstein and a couple others, do such great work over there. And so you deserve this in the ironical best sense of that term. And as I wrote on Twitter when I first heard about this, you're quoted numerous times. I already told you this before. You're quoted numerous times in my new book that I'm working on now because you do absolutely crucial journalism. So good for you in that sort of scary way. But so let me ask you, is Julian Assange doing solitary confinement at Belmarsh on your mind as you're sitting there? You already mentioned, what are they going to do to me? And you mentioned Belmarsh. They already have made an example out of him, and you're worried they're going to make one out of you too, huh?
Yeah, well, exactly. And I just think it's, I mean, funnily enough, I was reading Nils Melzer's book on, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on torture as I was flying in. That's been playing on my mind a lot. It's I just think that it in that context, yes, as I say, it seemed like a fishing expedition. It seemed like an attempt to gather all sorts of information. If it's the case that British intelligence legitimately think that Grayzone is a, FSB front, or that I myself am somehow, a Russian state operative, receiving secret directives and, from the Kremlin, then they're completely insane. They make Alex Jones look a sober and sensible analyst. Really, it's just mind-boggling. And I, when I was asked very detailed questions on how we receive leaks, etc., it did spring to mind that yes, they are trying to find out our sources. They specifically asked me when I, kicked off the interview, do you have any journalistic material with you? Because we wouldn't want to pick by accident. And I was asked all sorts of questions about my affiliations to press organizations and journalist unions, etc. And they were asking what kind of protections and benefits there are of joining these organizations. And it's just like, well, I mean, surely they would know that. Perhaps they truly were kind of operating in the dark. They don't understand how journalism works. And they were also trying to gauge how much trouble they were in for detaining me. It's all very perverse. Yes, one thing that did spring to mind when I was being grilled on non-existent connections to the FSB was how one of the reasons that the WikiLeaks was designated a hostile non-state actor by the CIA under Mike Pompeo. I think I was after the Vault 7 disclosures, bombshell stuff about the way that the CIA operates in digital spaces. The reason they did that was because they were tearing their proverbial hair out trying to prove that Julian had ties to Russia or was acting for Russia, and they couldn't prove it because there was no evidence. And it's like, well, yeah, in that context, well, I mean, might I or indeed Grayzone be subject to the same kind of categorization because they can't find this type of connection? There are all sorts of uncertainties and unknowns from my perspective. Even at this stage, the police still have some of my property. They have not. There's been no indication of when I might get it back. It's being held on the basis that an officer thinks that it may is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, be relevant to criminal proceedings. It's that in itself is disturbing and disquieting, and it has a chilling effect. We at the Grayzone, we refuse to be intimidated or bullied by anyone, I am extremely grateful to count as friends and colleagues some of the finest journalists and indeed the bravest journalists working today, as you mentioned, Alex Rubenstein, Anya Parampil, Max Blumenthal, and Aaron Mate, who've had my back every step of the way on this, and I'm forever indebted to them. In that context, when you receive leaked information, the where it comes from and whatever agenda the person leaking it or providing it to you has, is rather irrelevant. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly irrelevant when the CIA hack into, Iranian or Chinese or Russian government computers and then dump it on the internet via DDoS secrets, and then the Intercept publishers work on it and they win awards, and then it's used to justify the drone murder of General Soleimani. But I mean, that's a separate question. But yes, that like when you report on leaked information, the information itself is the source. If it can be authenticated and if it's in the public interest to publish it, then that it should be under existing press standards and conventions legitimate grounds. But no, we are shifting very, very, very quickly into the realm of even possessing or reporting on classified information is a criminal offence. In the UK, there is this hugely draconian and terrifying bit of legislation called the National Security Bill, which has been passed and will come into effect very soon, which will make it potentially up to life imprisonment for a journalist or a publisher or an editor to be in possession of classified material. This has received zero negative coverage in the mainstream British media. It has been basically ignored by every mainstream journalist covering national security. Now, could that be because it doesn't affect them at all? Like the kind of leaks, as I mentioned, that they're going to be publishing will be handed to them directly by the CIA or MI6 or any of these, this welter of sinister alphabet soup agencies that were really running things in the Western world. That when they publish quote unquote exclusives and all these scoops, it's because the powers that be want this information out there. They're not going to be affected by legislation that's massively restricting what the public is allowed to know, and yes, like what journalists are allowed to report on, because they're not journalists, they are stenographers for power.
Hey, listen, I mean, the thing is, this is so important, and I know you, and to you, it's all about you. You're the center of the story. But for everyone here, this is a fire bell in the night. This is the most important thing. The Ministry of Truth over there on Airstrip 1 is clamping down hard on an independent journalist. They don't have a First Amendment over there, but they are susceptible to public pressure and public opinion. And this should be an absolute scandal and outrage, and especially when they're doing this to a journalist of your caliber. And so I guess we'll see where the other reporters stand. Those who sacrifice Assange and say he's not a real journalist. Is that what they're going to try to say about you?
Now, we will see Aristotle's answer to this point also when we get there. So much for Heraclitus's fragments dealing with metaphysics. And now one last issue in connection with Heraclitus of an epistemological sort. He is the first man in the history of philosophy to regard the senses as invalid. The reason is very simple. By the evidence of our senses, it appears that there are permanent, motionless, unchanging things. And yet, he says, we know that that's not true. We know that everything is changing. And so we simply must say that our senses are deceptive. They're invalid. They are simply too gross to detect the degree of change that is actually taking place. Sometimes his followers say that the change which is taking place is analogous to letting water into a bathtub via one pipe and out via another at the same rate. So that an unwary spectator looking at the surface will say no change is taking place because, in fact, two opposite changes are taking place and canceling each other out. And sometimes they use other equally equivalent examples or caliber arguments to account for the appearance of permanence. But in any event, their viewpoint is we have shown by reason that reality is filled with nothing but change, and therefore we reject the senses. Therefore, an earth-shakingly important distinction is implicit in Heraclitus, the distinction between two realms, reality and appearance. Reality is that which really exists. In Heraclitus' view, it's a massive change. By the way, his reality is very often referred to as a Heraclitean flux, that being a way of describing nothing but change, which is riddled with contradictions beside. So there's reality, and on the other hand, there's the world as it appears to us, the world that the Greeks call the world of appearance. Reality is known by reason. Reason apart from the senses, reason in contradiction to the senses. And the world of appearances is the world as given us by the deceptive senses. Now this duality between reality and appearance and its corresponding epistemological duality of reason versus the senses runs all through Greek philosophy with one or two exceptions. And Heraclitus is the first in which you find it. Anyone who subscribes to this view and who says that reason is what we should follow, reason in this sense of the term, reason as opposed to the senses, is called philosophically a rationalist. And therefore Heraclitus can be regarded as the first Greek rationalist. Now, that's obviously not reason in any objectivist or Aristotelian sense of the term, but that's the way the terms are used. You will see that Plato, of course, is a rationalist in this sense also. Now, in order to be fully fair to the historical Heraclitus, I would like to point out that he himself believed, quite inconsistently with the rest of his philosophy, that change was actually orderly, lawful, intelligible. He was, in fact, one of the earliest formulators of the view that the events in the world occur according to law and can be understood by the human mind. He thought there was a law of change governing all the particular changes. Now, for his views on this question, I refer you to a history text. But he was, in this respect, and I say this out of fairness, a good rational Greek in this respect. The Greeks, almost without exception, and no matter how awful they became, always, almost without exception, had something good to say. It's only since Christianity took over that you have philosophers that are black from top to bottom. But the Greeks almost always have something good, and that's true even of Heraclitus. Unfortunately, the good element in him was not nearly as influential as his flux side. Now, I don't think I have to point out to you the prevalence of Heraclitianism today. Anybody who says it's a changing world and uses that in anything other than an utterly innocuous sense is a Heraclitian. Anybody who says there are no absolutes, everything is relative, is a full-fledged orthodox Heraclitian. Because absolute in such a context means invariant, unchanging in time or place, something which holds for all times and places. And of course, for Heraclitus, there is no such thing. There are no absolutes. If it's true today, it won't be true tomorrow, and so on. And of course, the same kind of relativism will be generated not only for knowledge in general, but for ethics and value theory in particular. There'll be no absolutes in ethics any more than in anything else, a viewpoint at which Heraclitus himself actually hinted, but simply hinted in one of his fragments, that ethical relativism is the conclusion to draw. If you ever found anybody who equates old-fashioned with false, that is Heraclitianism at work. The idea being, to take an example that I hear frequently, the American Constitution, for instance, must be wrong. Why? Well, it was formulated in the 18th century. So, well, now it's the 20th century. Period. Now, that argument is pure Heraclitus. If the person attempted to say, in the intervening years there have been changes and so on, well, that would be one thing. Specific changes that require a specific change. He'd be wrong, but at least that would be a different argument. But if he simply says, time has passed, and the 18th century can't be applicable in the 20th, why can't it? Because everything flows and nothing abides, and that is Heraclitus. Most skeptics base themselves partly on Heraclitus. How can you say that you know that such and such is really true? Maybe yesterday it was true, but how do you know about tomorrow? Everything changes. Everything is becoming. Dewey says at one point, John Dewey, that Aristotle's logic must be no good because it's worked for so long. You must need a new one. Now, as to what it would be like to live in the Heraclitian world, well, of course, physically you don't and you can't. But you can get a good taste of it, unless you're very fortunate, in your social existence. Because most people, to some extent, live in a Heraclitian world socially. A great many children live in that kind of world, thanks to the wanton irrationality of their parents, whose behavior is characterized by constant switching and swimming so that nothing ever holds true from one moment to the next, and by constant contradictions. That is the perfect recipe for the Heraclitian world. Most citizens, in relation to the government of a mixed economy, live in exactly that Heraclitian world. And if you want a kind of perfect example, most businessmen, in regard to the antitrust laws, live in an absolutely clear-cut textbook Heraclitian world. Because what are their complaints about the antitrust laws? One is, everything flows and nothing abides. Interpretations change from moment to moment, and you never know what's coming next. And the other is, everything in that world is and isn't. Is competition good? Yes, of course, because monopoly is bad. Is competition good? No, of course, because the efficient will then take away the markets of the inefficient. It is and it isn't. Now, that is Heraclitianism, and you see where it's getting us. If you want a marvelous portrayal of it, I remind you and suggest that you reread the scene in Atlas Shrugged between Cheryl and Dagny, where Cheryl comes at the climactic part in her relation with Taggart and is saying that everything is switching, everything is swimming, everything is changing, and she can't endure it or understand it. And Dagny says, tells her what she needs to know in essence, and tells her that there have been philosophers working for centuries To bring about just that state, well, the first and most influential of the philosophers that she refers to in this scene is Heraclitus. Why did Heraclitus not say that the law of change was the world stuff rather than the change itself? Well, first of all, he did not have a very clear idea of what the law of change consisted of. It was pretty much to the effect that there has to be a balance, and change in one direction in the so-called upward way has to balance change in another direction, the downward way. But I think the main point is that the law of change is simply a description of how change operates, and consequently is not something apart from change, although I grant you that according to some commentators, the law of change is reified by Heraclitus into an entity distinct from change, and many people think that it is one of the sources of the Christian God too. So you can throw that in the pot along with Parmenidean 1 if you want. Now let us turn to a philosopher who flourished about 20 years after Heraclitus, about 480 BC, and who represents a diametric opposite viewpoint, Parmenides, Parmenides. Parmenides comes from the town of Elea, E-L-E-A, and so his philosophy is frequently referred to as Eleaticism, or the Eleatic philosophy. Parmenides is the first, and judging by the fragments that we have, to support his convictions with reasoned argument.